hear more about how things are at the moment. In public, perhaps the most visible initiative now has been the EU taxonomy. And I come from the horticultural and botanical background, so taxonomy always meant to be the plant kingdom, but nevertheless, EU taxonomy, the classification system for environmentally sustainable economic activities, it will play an important role helping the EU scale up sustainable investment and implement the European Green Deal. There are different views on sustainability of different economic activities, especially as we have seen in the energy sector. But in any case, the economy needs rules that create security for investors, provide protection from greenwashing, and help shift investments where they are most needed. These proposals that I've listed here are primarily addressed at companies and corporate professionals, but there are also proposals that have their impact on products available to consumers. Sustainable Products Initiative will revise the Eco-Design Directive and propose additional legislative measures that aim to make products placed on the EU market more sustainable. And consumers, the environment and climate will benefit from products that are more durable, reusable, repairable, recyclable, and energy efficient. So consumers now should be considered to have a right to repair their products. And I can quote the Austrian example that there's a bonus for citizens who want to have their products repaired instead of going and buying new products. So this is really something new and quite innovative. So what else can the public sector and lawmakers do besides put forward legislation? I would like to turn our eyes on the need to lead by example and incorporate sustainability also to the public sector activities. And I'm looking into public procurement value chains. Indeed, there should be no reason why the similar due diligence obligations should not apply to public organizations when they purchase products or services, which we are now going to prepare for the private sector. The importance of public procurement in the EU is massive and is well known. Over 250,000 public authorities around the EU, 2 trillion euros every year, 14% of EU GDP approximately. Now, I'd like to highlight the example that Sweden is showing here. Sweden has decided to unleash the potential of public procurement for sustainability. There is a proposal in the pipeline to change the national public procurement law so that social and environmental considerations shall be taken into consideration, not just may be taken into consideration. Sweden seems also to be leading the discussion on how to make due diligence part of the public procurement. And I cannot overestimate the example by the Swedish public authorities, which have shown great sensitivity towards ethical aspects of public procurement. And this comes back to our discussion on COVID. We were badly in need of personal protection equipment, and there was not enough production of it. But then we discovered that not only were there disruptions in value and supply chains, but we also discovered that the people that actually were producing the rubber gloves for us in Malaysia were very, to a large extent, migrant labor workers, which could be called modern day slaves. So I think Sweden is showing already the next step, and I believe that the European Union should next look into how it should revise its public procurement directives from 2014 so that they will be truly in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Now, lastly, on the importance of SMEs. I believe it's fair to say that SMEs have suffered most from the COVID crisis. Therefore, they deserve specific attention during the recovery. There's much debate whether size in the future sustainable corporate governance should define which companies are within the scope of the legislation. I can tell you that the MEPs working on this proposal have received several contacts from SMEs, in, for example, the textile sector. They're worried of the fact that SMEs would be excluded from the scope of these pieces of legislation on sustainable corporate governance. Why? Because they are producing sustainably, ethically, responsibly, and they suffer from their competitors, for instance, in public tenders. And I quote a Dutch company, Schrijvens. It's a smaller workwear company. And it's a good example of a company which wants to have a level playing field. So also to be included in the sustainable corporate governance due diligence obligations. Namely, Schrijvens has for years done hard work to ensure sustainable production and value chains and was quite unhappy to be excluded from a public procurement of the military in the Netherlands due to a slightly higher price while being the more sustainable option. So we need to consider this kind of business opportunities also for SMEs with the new responsible business conduct revolution. Of course, proportionality is the key. Sustainability reporting and other legislation must apply to all companies of all sizes. But requirements should scale according to the size of operations so that SMEs always have more to win than to lose from these changes. Now we are in the campaign meeting of Accountancy Europe. So my last word about the role of accountancy. I believe that this saying is really true. What you cannot measure, you cannot perceive or even improve. If the legislation, which is now on its way at the European level, will be effective, on top of measurement, we need verification of the efficiency. So accounting and auditing are central pieces in telling the difference between green and greenwashing, ethical and just seem to be ethical. This applies to companies small and large alike. Even it applies to the EU itself. The EU's new recovery fund, the RRF, will spend more than 700 billion euros by the end of 2026. And we need to make sure that it is fully in line with the requirements of greening and digitalization, of course, also. So auditors and accountants have a crucial role in ensuring that the money is well spent and that it contributes to the sustainability targets as it is intended to. But being successful in this task requires that also accountancy professionals understand and start to talk sustainability language so that the comprehensive approach is undertaken. So this is exactly why we are here, why Accountancy Europe has organized this event, I believe. So I wish you a very good and sustainable event. Thank you very much.
You're working on it.
Thank you very much, Heidi. I think there is some echo because I can hear myself speaking. I think it would be great if the mic is turned off in the main room. I really wanted to thank you very much, Heidi, because I think you've made quite a number of very important points, starting with your opening question. Why didn't we do that 20 years ago? You could even have said 40 years ago, I think, because we seem to not realize that the later we start transition, the toughest it's going to be. And I'm afraid a number of member states are following the route of going back to business as usual. I'd really like this resolve the echo issue because there is quite a lot of echo right now. I think you also made a number of important points on product design, leveraging the power of public procurement and how difficult this is. The example of Sweden is really interesting. Also, how competition in reality can be counterproductive if there is no level playing field, because at the end of the day, it leads to encouraging those who are doing less compared to those who are doing more. So I think all your points are very well taken. And also, I thank you for your encouragement to the accountancy profession. And I can tell you that we at Accountancy Europe are fully playing our role and are contributing to changing also within the profession. So thank you very much for all these remarks. I think you very rightly also outlined the importance of SMEs. I mean, that is one of our strategic priority at Accountancy Europe because SMEs are the essence of the European economy. We're going to have a discussion on SMEs in this first panel, which will be moderated by my colleague, Johan Barros. And Johan, you've got a fantastic panel to talk about this issue, and I'm delighted to give you the floor. Thank you. Thank you again, Heidi.
Thank you very much, Olivier, and thank you very much, Heidi, for your introductory remarks. And on behalf of the team, we would just like to apologize for the sound issues that we are experiencing this morning. I'm hoping that things will resolve, although now it seems to be good. Could I invite my panelists to please turn their cameras on? Very good. So as Olivier indicated, this first panel is going to be focusing on SMEs post-COVID green recovery. So the context is obvious to everyone following these issues. So with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the future due diligence legislative framework, SMEs are expected to face an increase in demand from supply chain partners, from financial institutions, from the civil society to start providing more sustainability information into the public sphere. So the panel that we bring together to you this morning consists of representatives from the SME sector, from the banking sector, and from the civil society. And we will be discussing key questions such as why the sustainable transition is so relevant for SMEs, who will need this sustainability information from SMEs and for what purpose, what difficulties SMEs may face in addressing to these demands, and what support, crucially, SMEs might need to be realistically able to fulfill these expectations, especially in this very difficult post-COVID context that Olivier also mentioned. So the speakers this morning are, on top of myself, of course, moderating the discussion, will be Alexandra Palinska, who is a Senior Research and Advocacy Officer at Finance Watch, Burçak İnel, who's the Director for Financial Sustainable and Inclusive Growth in the European Banking Federation, and finally, Luc Hendricks, who is a Director at SME United. So just to kickstart the discussion of the morning, so Alexandra, obviously we hear a lot from the civil society for the need for sustainability disclosures, including from SMEs. So could you just briefly explain to us why do you believe that SMEs are so important for this sustainability disclosure specifically and for the green transition more generally?
Thank you so much, Johan, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today and discuss with you this very important topic. Maybe just firstly, 2 sentences about who we are, what is Finance Watch, as I'm not sure whether all of you are familiar with our organization. We are a Brussels-based NGO and expertise center with a mission to make finance serve society. Financial stability, preventing greenwashing, and accelerating the transition towards sustainable finance and sustainable economy are among our key objectives. Now, maybe just to kick start with a little bit of a kind of food for thought, I'd like to share my screen. Let me just see. Hopefully I'm going to be able to do that. Okay, I think let's do that. Now, if you could, Johan, tell me whether you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen very well.
Okay, so just I would say here maybe start with something slightly controversial. So I hope you can read what is actually written on this comic stripe here, but maybe just to read it also aloud. I used to agree with you that climate change was real, until I found out how much it would cost to fix it. I think this is a very sad reality we are often confronted with, that basically, we try to calculate the cost of everything, which of course it is important. But at the same time, I think we need to be focused on the bigger picture and what are the real priorities and the real problems we are faced with. Maybe another teeny tiny food for thought, and then I promise I stop with that. Okay, just one more time. Okay, so yes, to put things into the perspective. Johan, can you see my screen?
Perfectly well.
Yes. Well, so that's another, I would say here, I would say description of what we are currently facing. We are all very concerned about COVID. And of course, it is an important matter. It is an important problem that we are all faced with, and that has a very important impact on our economy and daily lives. But what we sometimes tend to forget, that other problems, like for instance climate change, that we very often kind of tend to close our eyes to because it's just a very inconvenient truth and basically something we don't necessarily know how to exactly tackle, or even if we know, because it costs too much or because it's too much effort, it is not convenient, eventually we just keep delaying the actions, or we actually even tend to say that maybe it's not important we do that. And well, basically that's I think the major problem here. Meanwhile, this decade is crucial to actually make the change. I do hope that I don't have to convince any of you that the climate change is real and it is happening, and that actually our entire, I would say, not only economy, but our lifestyles may completely be destroyed in the future years if we don't take an urgent action, an impactful action. But what I think is also important to emphasize, that scientists stress this decade is critical in the fight against climate change and to prevent an environmental disaster. If we don't act now, if we don't take impactful actions, it might be too late to actually prevent, reverse climate change, and basically meet the Paris Agreement targets and EU goals. We no longer have time to lose, and it won't be possible to do business if we destroy our planet. This is why, despite the COVID pandemic, all of us, including SMEs, need to make an effort to transition towards a sustainable economy. So this is, I would say, the big picture reason why SMEs also need, I would say, to be actually covered by certain rules, why SMEs also need to take certain actions so that we can collectively actually ensure we can transition towards a sustainable economy. But speaking maybe a little bit more concretely now, for instance, in the context of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, there are also, I would say in a way, additional reasons why it is important that SMEs from high-risk sectors should be included in the scope of mandatory sustainability-related reporting. While, of course, subject to proportionate rules, and hence EFRAG will be preparing a bespoke proportionate standard for SMEs that such companies would report against. And the reasons here are twofold. Firstly, if we look actually at the data, if only micro companies were to be excluded from the scope of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, it would still actually cover less than 10% of EU companies. This is why, to have a meaningful impact, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive must include SMEs from high-risk sectors, or at minimum, medium-sized companies. On top of that, such companies can have a profound and wide-reaching impact on the environment and society. Also, sustainability risks may lead to widespread and profound financial impact on companies and their operations. Neglecting sustainability risks, whether by large or medium-sized companies or even smaller ones, may have a knock-on effect that can lead to economic disruption and financial instability. And I think, here what we are actually witnessing with COVID is a kind of, a preludium to what might happen later. It's already, a kind of little sampling of what might happen if we don't act now. And of course, you could also say, well, isn't it better just to basically, require companies, okay, stop polluting, put on very tight environmental norms? Well, yes, probably it would be better, it would be faster, it would be more impactful. But unfortunately, we live in the kind of, political environment where basically this is, way too controversial. And that's why, at the end of the day, sustainable finance agenda and strategy as focuses, primarily to a large extent actually on disclosure requirements. But nevertheless, it is hoped that basically if transparency is improved with regards to sustainability matters, eventually that may also, I would say, encourage companies actually to do more in that respect, while at the same time it will provide investors and other information users with important information they need in order to make informed decisions with regards to their investments. Well, maybe additional, just very quick point with regards to sustainable corporate governance, the forthcoming Commission initiative on this topic. Well, ideally, it would be also good to actually include SMEs in the scope of mandatory due diligence, especially that they are part of value chains. So at the end of the day, it can be questioned whether, for instance, we can have proper mandatory due diligence also, done by large companies in case if they would not really get the information on their, for instance, suppliers that very often are SMEs. Well, so basically, I think I'll just start with that. And I do realize that I think I'm going to be very much challenged, especially by Luc. But anyway, very happy to discuss further.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. Look, indeed, it sounds like she's expecting a lot of responses from you, so I hope you took a lot of notes on that. So Alexandra Burczak mentioned that one of the key stakeholders that will be expecting some sustainability information from SMEs are investors and finance providers. So could you just elaborate to us, what are you hearing from your members? What are you hearing from the ground, so to say? What will your members, what will the banks expect from SMEs, and when?
Thank you very much, Johan, and good morning to everybody. Really pleasure to be here. I do wish that we were physically in the same place, but it almost feels like we are. So by way of introduction, I want to say a few things about banks and sustainability and how broadly we're involved in that, and SMEs, and then I'll answer your questions about exactly what kind of data and when we need it. And I can already say that actually it's far too soon and it's probably far too much. So, I mean, that's no spoiler. So by way of introduction, the EBF, which represents 3,000 banks through 32 national banking associations, by the way, of which, of course, the biggest component among the clientele are the SMEs, is approaching sustainability in the broad sense, SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. The EBF has itself endorsed the Principles for Responsible Banking, which commits the banking sector to all the 17 SDGs in a structured way provided by the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, which means that we do care about the interlinkages between the different SDGs. Of course, it's not just about climate, and it's not just about environment. It's about job growth as well, education, equality, a lot of different dimensions that the UN framework looks at. And also more broadly, in a more narrow sense, in a narrower sense, we have also committed to the Net Zero Alliance. And so we're promoting all these different things across our membership. And on taxonomy, we're very active and I would say very constructive. And next month, we're coming up with a report that will help the banks apply the taxonomy to their balance sheets, including, for instance, for general purpose lending. On SMEs, we definitely track access to finance difficulties, and I'm very happy to say that also with Johan's Association Accountancy Europe and others, we have looked at this issue also in the context of the current crisis. And we have an initiative that brings together different stakeholders to resolve issues related to the viability of SMEs after the pandemic, whenever that may be, the after. And so we really do care about access to finance. And as many of you, I think, here know, the ECB, the SAFE survey also tracks this, and the European Commission tracks this. We have, by the way, also our own code that commits the banking sector to providing feedback to SMEs when their loan applications are declined. And that's, I think, quite an important thing. Basically, this is the context in which we're approaching now the current sustainability reporting challenge. Now, it's a challenge that we must overcome because, as has been noted by several speakers, not only Alexandra, but also our first speaker from the Parliament, SMEs must be a part of the solution to meet sustainability goals of Europe. So we cannot leave the business done by SMEs, the employment done by provided by SMEs, the things that they provide to the rest of the economy outside of the equation of our sustainable finance infrastructure. And that's very important. But also, it is important because SMEs really need to be a part of this system to continue to have access to finance to meet sustainability goals for themselves. And I want to mention a couple of numbers that I picked up from an EIB analysis. For instance, SMEs are, of course, as expected, lagging behind larger firms in terms of setting climate targets, having dedicated climate staff, having energy audits, just to name some. 40% of SMEs have already invested in climate in some way, and 20% more have not done any, but they want to invest in the future. And all these numbers are lower than larger companies, which means that SMEs not only should not face any new credit crunch, any new constraints to access to finance, but they even need more finance than before if we want them to be a part of the solution. And also, a side point, we shouldn't only think of bank lending, but we should also think of capital markets financing, which many existing SMEs might need, but also some of the new generation of digital-born companies will also need. Startups, the innovation to come from these SMEs, and also just the very act of operating in a digital context is something that will help the solution. And now, what kind of data? I think I need to wrap up because I'm at my time, 5 minutes. So what kind of data? I think some of the details we can discuss later. You know that banks are very much also themselves subject to scrutiny from their stakeholders. Employees, by the way, the new generation of employees of banks will also want to be working for sustainable banks. Shareholders, of course, will want to invest in banks that are sustainable, whose balance sheets are sustainable, whose products are sustainable. And banks are also very much looked at by their regulators. And just this week, we had the new implementing ITS, the technical standard for the prudential regulation Pillar 3. And that, for instance, requires banks to do additional reporting. So we have banks reporting requirements as listed entities, as banks regulated by their supervisors, and just generally subject to the taxonomy Article 8 as well. And I would also emphasize banks need information also for themselves to be able to adapt their businesses to the new realities, new expectations on them. And now I want to end with a couple of numbers. Not to alarm us, but these are the hard realities. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive was mentioned many times. Although we're currently talking about listed SMEs being in the scope for 2023, I think we need to think of the fact that the larger undertakings have to already report in 2023, listed SMEs later, of course, with a lag. We have to consider that the large undertakings, which already have to do the reporting, will need information from the smaller ones, whether those smaller ones, listed or unlisted, are subject to the CSRD or not. Pillar 3 I mentioned just this Monday, so we found out that we as banks have to disclose our taxonomy alignment of risk exposures to corporates as of July 2024, which means we need that information earlier. And so the list goes on, and I think this is so. I would conclude with the feeling with the principle that SMEs need this information for themselves and also for the business that they're in, whether or not it is legally required for them or not. And I think in that context, we need to find a simplified reporting standard for SMEs, and that's the work of EFRAG that we can talk about later. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Božek, for those introductory words. So, Luke, we have heard from civil society and we have heard from the banking sector that there are a lot of expectations for SMEs to start doing a lot of things in the area of sustainability and sustainability disclosures sooner, preferably rather than later. But the same we hear from many of our members as well is that many SMEs are still struggling in a very difficult economic context. We are still struggling with the pandemic economic impacts, and of course the impacts on SMEs are multiplied by the impacts that they may have on larger businesses. So what do you hear from your members? Well, how are SMEs doing at the moment? I mean, are they ready to start thinking about their business sustainability now? Is this a bit too much, a bit too fast in your view?
Well, first of all, Johan, thank you for inviting SME United to this webinar. I'm a little bit in doubt if I should answer your question directly or immediately go to the comments that have been made by Alexandra. But I think that nevertheless we have to take into account the actual situation. As you mentioned, and I do not want that this should be seen as an excuse, but we have to look at the reality now. The situation of the SMEs is still at the moment unsure. There are still actual burning issues with COVID and its implications in a lot of countries. There are still some lockdowns. By the way, a lot of the SMEs are at the end of their financial resources. During the last years, they had to use their own financial resources and their reserves. We still have, although there is a growing demand, we have disrupted supply chains, we have increasing energy prices, and that's true for everybody. Also an increase in the raw material, there are shortages. And also more and more there is now the absence of employees in the SMEs due to COVID. And that leads, of course, also to additional cost. And for example, a lot of the SMEs, they are also suffering from a reduced turnover due to the fact that there are no employees, and they have to now also to hire extra workforce, which indeed will also lead to extra cost. At the same time, they have also, because this is also one of the future challenges, they have to invest also in the digital transition and also more and more in cybersecurity, and this cannot be done overnight. That's the actual situation, so not very positive. But at the same time, and there I would already like to highlight that we have also to build on their resilience. And their SME United and our member organizations are fully supporting sustainable transition. And the sustainable transition is equally relevant for SMEs. So let there be no doubt. In any case, the sustainable transition if SMEs are not part of it, they will be in any case excluded from the market. And also the sustainable transition is necessary for the SMEs because it will also lead to better products, but also to rationalize their energy consumption, reduce their waste production, and it will also increase their independence. So once again, the green transition is necessary. But the key point is, if we are talking about the CSRD, that the green transition and the need to have this green transition has nothing to do with sustainable reporting. Why not? We have estimated the cost of the CSRD, which is at the moment very difficult to estimate because even the Commission was not able to calculate or refused to calculate the possible financial consequences for SMEs of the proposal. We estimate a cost between 10 and 200 billion euro only to make sustainable reporting, knowing that finance is limited. We think it would be better to invest this money in order to help SMEs towards the green transition than to oblige them to invest in a kind of sustainable reporting, which in the immediate future will certainly not help them to reach the goals of the green transition. Ms. Huttela also mentioned, and now I'm turning to the due diligence corporate governance proposal, mentioned why did we do this not 20 years ago? I must say that SME United already in 10 years ago has asked the public authorities, the European Commission and the European Parliament, in order to help SMEs, to help them in their due diligence obligations towards their supply chain. 10 years ago, we have asked this. We have also asked this help towards the NGOs who were active in this field, also towards the Commission. We never have received a positive answer from those entities. So let it be clear, we are fully supporting the green transition of the SMEs, but the CSRD is certainly not an answer to this.
Thanks, Luc, for that outlook of the SME situation, and also it was very interesting to hear the cost estimation that you provided on the potential cost for SMEs to transition to sustainability reporting. So on that note, Alexandra, we have now heard a bit more about the reality of the SMEs on the ground. How do you respond?
Well, I know it's tough for certain SMEs, especially right now with COVID. And I think we do hear about, many companies that are closing. However, I think we also need to be mindful that there are many SMEs that are actually very innovative and entrepreneurial and basically are just, shifting a lot of their business, online and are actually still able to make a living. So I think it's also, the reality of business that you're always faced with certain risks, and basically you need to be able to adapt also to the situation. But of course, at the same time, I think the role of countries, member states, is also crucial right now in order to actually support the businesses in this difficult situation, and also, hence the role of the European Union. And that is why we do have the recovery plan for Europe, right? To basically, and the next generation EU in order to support businesses and, actually support member states who can actually provide more support to the companies. Of course, we could all have a completely separate debate to what extent, I would say in terms of the EU funds, how effectively distributed they are and all this, but this is a completely separate one. Look, you said that sustainable reporting has nothing to do with the EU green transition. I feel this is a very strong statement. And again, even though I said that, of course, maybe it could be more impactful just to have much stricter rules, environmental rules, and basically tell companies, okay, stop polluting or already cut your emissions, in a much shorter time than 2030 target by a certain amount. Or also, stricter rules on waste disposal and everything else. But the sad reality that this kind of changes have been blocked by business lobbies. So now my question to you would be, well, if you are saying, okay, let's do it differently, would you be prepared to, for instance, issue a statement saying that, I don't know, if SMEs are exempted from sustainability reporting, you support much more stringent environmental rules, and basically to try to do it this way? Also, another question I would have, look, I understand that reporting as such can be seen as a burden. But at the same time, I think whenever there is transparency, people tend to actually try harder so that I can actually demonstrate whether they perform well or not. The problem is that in the absence of transparency, we don't know what is really happening. You're saying, okay, let's allow to invest this money by the SMEs into environmental transition. Okay, fine, let's do that. But how will we know it was invested in environmental transition and how environmental actually those projects were if you're not going to report against that? I mean, the thing is like, look, I can understand that maybe what you fear is some kind of, complex disclosures, but the bottom line is, whatever investment is being made, you have to be transparent about, basically whether and what you are doing with it. There has been so many cases of greenwashing and still is ongoing greenwashing. And, we hear about, for instance, I don't know, green bonds that are financing building actually huge car parks, which have nothing to do with environmental matters. I mean, there are so many, cases and so many, I would say, also uncertainties, even in terms of regular products that are being sold as bio, green, sustainable, while in reality they are not. And hence also here the role of also accountants, of course, auditors, but yes, of the verification altogether. But how can you also verify things if you don't report it in the first place? So these would be my questions back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. And Luke, before I pass the floor back to you, I would actually be very interested to hear from you, Burčak, because Luke was also saying that the sustainability reporting should maybe not be the first thing that SMEs do in this sustainable transition. And on the other hand, he was also outlining the very, very practical difficulties that SMEs are facing in this post-pandemic context. So do you have any reactions to that? And also specifically, would you have any ideas on what kind of support, concrete support SMEs might benefit from to help them to go on this transition?
Thank you. I think the point of view expressed by both Luke and Alexandra are valid. So as often in life, I think the solution lies somewhere in between. From the bank point of view, clearly the reporting that we do, which we have to do, is not worth much if we don't have the data. And in fact, we won't even be able to do the reporting if we don't have the data. So that's on the other hand, everything has to be done with the needs of those providing the data in mind. So I would split it into, first what we need, what kind of reporting we need, and then and to bring it back to what kind of financing we need. And these are linked. The reporting we need from SMEs has to be, of course, appropriate for their size and complexity. Obviously, it has to be adapted, depending on the size. And this we can do if we use the EFRAG-led process well. And I know that Luc is involved in that as well, and the EBF is involved, and we're right now working quite hard to get input from our bankers on what kind of a simplified reporting standard would be appropriate for SMEs. And obviously, this can be useful for listed SMEs, but also for others. And I think it has to be a reporting standard that will be so appropriate that it will be picked up also on a voluntary basis. I think that's quite important. And the other thing is we need to have a standard that eliminates the need for multiple types of reporting, because one of the reasons for the complexity and the cost is when an SME is asked for the same information in different ways, in different formats by different institutions. So to the extent possible, we need to reduce that and have only one kind of reporting that an SME needs to do. And finally, the reporting, the information that the SME will look at in order to do its reporting has to be also useful to it, to the SME's own management. However simple its structure is, an SME will also need information to plan the year ahead in terms of energy costs, in terms of insulation, in terms of finding more sustainable sources of its supplies. So it has to be useful to the SME. And all that, I hope, will be the result of the EFRAG work. And also the EFRAG work, by the way, in terms of timing, has to be ready when it is needed. And I think that means acceleration. In terms of financing, and that will be my final thought, I think we need to think of lending, capital markets, and also concessional lending or blended funds together in a holistic way. In terms of the reporting that goes into it. Obviously, all of these have different different roles in an economy. And obviously, an SME will need a loan for something else. It will maybe need a financial markets product for something else. And a different kind of investment might be the target of an EIB loan or guarantee, EIB group. But the reporting has to be holistic so that things don't get even extra complicated. And I say this, for instance, because EIB also needs to have a simplified reporting standard, and I think they're working on that. And this also has to be in line with what we're working on with EFRAG. And finally, perhaps since I've mentioned capital markets, green bonds, Alexandra, I think the proposal is very important. I agree with you that we shouldn't have greenwashing. So we're quite optimistic that the green bond proposal currently being discussed will lead to a product that investors can trust and which can then finance a certain kind of investment that we can all have confidence in.
Thanks very much, Boček, for your intervention. And so, Luc, I'm happy to pass the floor on to you now for some reactions. But also, there is already an audience question that I want to launch to you, because Boček, I'm very happy that you brought up the EFRAG standard setting process. And Luc, indeed, you are very closely involved in the EFRAG's SME standard setting. So the question from the audience was, to what degree should the EU standards be compatible with the IFRS sustainability standards, and whether you believe that those would be closer, or maybe the IFRS standards might be a bit less burdensome for SMEs. So do you have a feeling on whether this EFRAG is the right place to come up with robust, simplified SME standards, or do you have a bit more faith perhaps in this IFRS standards thing?
There are a lot of things that I have to reply now in a couple of minutes.
Take your time, Luc, it's okay.
No. First of all, towards the remarks from the first remarks. My remark is still when there is the request to have information about the investments of small and medium-sized enterprises, remark that we are already making since many years is, who is going to read all the reports from the 22 million SMEs? I don't think, Alexandra, that you are going to do so. Second thing, are SMEs transparent? Yes, SMEs are transparent. They already know. You don't have any problem. You go into a retail shop, and if you want, you can speak immediately with the owner. Contrary to bigger enterprises, then when you call them, you are connected with a help desk somewhere in India. So there is transparency on most of the issues. And our SMEs are in favor of voluntary reporting, because we see indeed the usefulness of it for themselves. We are saying this already for more than 10 years. Voluntary reporting. And this is also an answer to the remark of Heidi when she said that there was this Dutch company asking to be included. Well, there is no problem at all, because this Dutch textile company can already report on it, because on a voluntary basis it's possible. So it's not necessary to have compulsory reporting. But now on the CSRD, the problem with the CSRD, because there also, Alexandra, you said, oh, EFRAG will come up with a simplified proportionate standard for small and medium-sized enterprises. We are trying to work on this. And even if we are going to produce such a standard, the big problem is that there is no guarantee at all that this simplified standard will be accepted by the big enterprises. And even the Commission is recognizing this problem and is not willing to solve this problem, because they said we cannot oblige the big enterprises to accept this simplified standard. So this is a problem. So it's easy to say you need transparency, but you have to look at the concrete situation of this standard and of the SMEs, and this is completely lacking. So the CSRD is certainly at this moment not the ideal tool for small and medium-sized enterprises to report on, because if we look at the CSRD, the main objective is that that companies should report to their investors, and indeed to their investors, while it is completely forgotten. And this is also something that we are insisting in. Normally, sustainable reporting, financial reporting, should be a management tool for the entrepreneur themselves, so that he can compare with its peers. And this aspect of sustainable reporting is completely lacking in the CSRD, because the emphasis is on the reporting towards some big investors, while the stakeholders of the SMEs are completely out of the reporting.
Thanks very much, Luke, for that. Alexandra, would you like to intervene?
Of course. Well, maybe to react to Luke, and then also try to answer the question that Johan, you mentioned. Look, you're saying, okay, SMEs are transparent already, and that you can just walk into the store, speak to the manager. Yes, then I will have to trust that what he says is true. Not mentioning that maybe I don't have, if you're saying, oh, who's gonna, check all the SMEs reports? Well, maybe it's not about checking all SMEs reports, but the ones you're interested in. However, maybe it could be claimed that indeed maybe national competent authorities actually should start actually, verifying such information. I mean, but obviously first we have to actually acquire it is reported. But the point here is this information should be disclosed on a company website. I don't think anybody has time to go from store to another and actually check all the information, not mentioning that not all businesses actually have physical presence, especially now also in the COVID times. How would I know that actually the manager is saying the truth? How would I know he even actually, I don't know, checked what is their water usage, what is their, I don't know, what waste disposal, whatever. I mean, the amount of waste they're producing, the chemical content, whether they're polluting or not, what is their CO2 emissions. I mean, in most of the case, they have no idea. And actually, this is also the problem. And here I would agree with you. Sustainability reporting is important for SMEs also because they need to start aware of of two things: their impact on the environment and the society, but even more importantly, from very pure financial perspective and economic stability perspective. To be aware of the sustainability risks they are faced stemming from the environmental degradation, climate change, and societal challenges. Because look, if those companies will not be actually trying to understand sustainability risks, they might not be aware that, maybe you should actually move your headquarters somewhere else because soon you will be actually in the area that will actually be completely flooded. Or maybe actually, if you don't move your premises, basically in a couple of years' time, this will be the area that will be subject to wildfires or whatever else. So yes, it is important, even for the sake of that the SMEs become aware of the sustainability risks and the potential and actual adverse impacts their business causes on the environment and society. And I don't think that, just trusting the word of a manager is actually going to solve that. We need reliable, comparable, and publicly available data that is verified. And look, we are not necessarily talking about some super complex things. At the end of the day, we could agree on just a kind of even handful of indicators, like, yes, what is your, I don't know, CO2 emissions? What is your water use? What is your, I don't know, do you actually have some, I don't know, chemical waste that you are actually disposing of, and how do you manage that? And, a number of things could be done on a kind of, allowing also SMEs to explain actually how they do it. It doesn't have to be rocket science. And you're saying, that SMEs and other businesses, which is by the way true, has been asking for 10 years now for voluntary reporting. Yes, and the results are very meager. And by the way, large companies have been doing the exact same things since 2014. Actually, review of when actually the non-financial information directive was negotiated. At the beginning, large businesses were also saying, we don't need mandatory disclosures because we're already doing fine. Well, actually they weren't. And also that is why also now we have a review of those rules, because actually based on the impact assessment commission and the different studies commission concluded that actually the information disclosed is not good enough, it is not comparable, and it is not reliable enough.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. Sorry, I do have to move on because I just...
Can I just answer very quickly the question on the IFRS? Please.
Yes, okay, please go.
Very quickly. So here the point is, of course, we do need global sustainability reporting standards, but right now what we need to focus on is European sustainability reporting standards for at least two, if not more reasons. Because in Europe we already have a very specific sustainable finance, I would say here, regulatory landscape, and basically now, as pointed very well by Burczak, with whom, honestly, I agree, Burczak, with most of the points, or I think even everything you said. And the thing is, the thing is what we need the standard and the rules that will be aligned properly with the other sustainable finance regulatory regulations and rules, and basically to ensure that all of the pieces of the puzzle fit together, because otherwise actually financial companies won't be able to produce their own disclosures. And a second reason is we do need to ensure that EU sustainability standards reflect the double materiality perspective that I just elaborated on a moment ago, so that it considers sustainability risks and the adverse impacts. Meanwhile, unfortunately, IFRS seems to be going, I would say, and here the developments about international actually sustainability reporting standards. I mean, they keep saying that they want to focus on actually sustainability risks, hence the financial, I would say, perspective only for the moment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alexandra, for that. Luke, before I pass the floor back to you, I just wanted to ask from Burczak about this voluntary disclosure by SMEs and banks inevitably having this need for some SME information. So have you had any thinking in your membership or together with SME United around maybe coming up with something that Alexandra was describing, basically some kind of a framework of agreed minimum disclosures that banks can reasonably expect from SMEs? Just to kind of set up a reasonable framework that SMEs also have something to work towards too.
Well, we're working on that, and I must say, SMEs will be our main partner in this. So, it's not something that can happen outside the SME community. As I mentioned before, there's lending, of course. So there's the bilateral relationship, the bilateral disclosure to a bank, and obviously, the more way harmonized that is, the better. On the other hand, you need to allow a little bit of space for variation among banks in terms of their ambitions, in terms of their, business ambitions, because we want to actually have a competitive sector. And there might be also differences in their circumstances. So not everything should be harmonized. But on the other hand, from the SME point of view, especially in the spectrum of SMEs, with less complexity, that are smaller, with fewer resources, you want to minimize the number of times that an SME is approached for bilateral and multilateral information, and you want to reduce the complexity of the both the content and the format. So my final word on this would be, what the SMEs say is a problem should be taken very seriously. For instance, just heard Luke say, the acceptability of the, simplified standards by the larger corporations, could be a major obstacle. So all of this, I think we have to take very seriously. There can be no solution that SMEs are unwilling to accept. So it's not something that can be pushed down their throat. It has to fit the SME community. And by the way, what we haven't discussed too much today is the whole ecosystem of ratings, auditing, SAP. So the whole ecosystem has to support the SME community to provide the information that we need from them, for them to be a part of the solution, and for the rest of the system to be a part of the solution.
Thanks very much, Burczak. And I'm indeed realizing that 1 hour definitely is not enough for a topic like this. Luke, I'm happy to pass on the floor to you. Just a quick reflection also from our CEO Olivier to you, who was reflecting on the point made by Hauta, that basically those SMEs that are already a bit more advanced in the green transition, having already made some investments, would they not be in a competitive disadvantage if there is no mandatory requirement for other SMEs to also kind of start following those same standards? So do you have any views on those, and obviously on anything else that the other speakers have said? And sorry, Burkhard, could I ask you to mute yourself? Yeah, thank you.
No, certainly not. It's not a competitive disadvantage. On the contrary, those who are already investing in it, they have and will have a competitive advantage. So, and this is also my reaction towards Alexandra. I mean, she did not listen to what I have said. We, as SME United and our organizations, are in favor of voluntary sustainability reporting because it is an advantage. It can be an advantage for the company, and you can compare yourself with your peers. It's also important in view of of your employer's branding. So there are a lot of advantages on sustainable reporting, but it should remain voluntary. And there also, once again, I have not said that we have asked already for 10 years for voluntary reporting. No, I have said that already 10 years in the field of due diligence, we have asked for support from public authorities to help our SMEs to fulfill their due diligence obligations in the supply chain already 10 years ago. So we as SMEs, and especially also in the textile sector and so on, in the whole supply chain, we could use this help, because at the moment there are no tools at all to help SMEs in their supply chain. And then the second thing, again, on the cost. The CSRD, as it stands today, although there is no formal obligation to include small and medium-sized enterprises through the trickle-down effect, a lot of SMEs will be obliged to report towards their suppliers, but also towards the banks. And there are also, as Burčak mentioned, we as SME United, we are negotiating with the banking sector already more than 2 years in order to have a simplified reporting. And there I'm very happy that Alexandra mentioned that she could agree on the simplified reporting concerning CO2 emissions, concerning waste and so on. Okay, this is exactly what we are asking, because this is feasible for small and medium-sized enterprises. So no problem at all, and I hope that we can have a discussion bilaterally on this.
Thanks very much, Luc, for that. And we are now approaching the end of the panel. I think I will extend it by just a couple of minutes because we also started with a bit of delay. There was one audience question that I did want to address to all of you, which was essentially whether you believe that the current EU SME definition is fit for purpose when we talk about sustainability. Or should we be talking about maybe, different categories of SMEs or different sectors? Or Luc, maybe you want to immediately react to that, Alexandra, then Burčak?
Sorry, I mean, this is an eternal question since 30 years. The Commission has finally closed this file last year, at the end of the year, saying there is no need to review the SME definition. Please, there are other more burning issues than to discuss the SME definition. So it is still fit for purpose.
Thanks very much. Alexandra?
Sure. On this one, I would put it this way. I mean, of course, we could debate it, but as Luc said, it's been an eternal question, not very easy to solve. I would rather say there is a need for defining in EU law what is high-risk sectors, so that actually we can then, in the context of corporate sustainability reporting, but later on also in the context of sustainable corporate governance, forthcoming initiative, that we could actually also ensure that SMEs, or at least mid-sized companies from high-risk sectors, are included in the scope of regulatory requirements. Just very quickly on
those high-risk sectors, Alexandra. I mean, everybody's talking about it, but nobody is saying what it means.
Well, there are proposals for that, which I'm very happy to share, produced already by certain NGOs. Of course, it's not a debate you can solve within 30 seconds of or 1 minute of discussion. But the thing is, look, at the end of the day, it could be also, and I understand that actually as part of the EU lab, the project task force within EFRA, I mean, there have been already discussions on that. And I think this is, basically technical work that requires a little bit more reflection and discussion. But the main objective is to identify, which sectors are potentially or actually, causing, I would say, what is the highest likelihood of those sectors that actually do cause significant harm to the environment or society. Or, for instance, what I would also add, it is important also to look at those sectors or companies in those geographic areas which might be subject to higher sustainability risks. Very quickly on the OECD and actually due diligence support for SMEs, my understanding is that actually there are already tools to have SMEs, and of course that could be further reinforced. First of all, actually OECD guidelines already actually also, I would say they're trying to provide some indication and help, for actually how SMEs could also report and what information to produce to, I would say eventually feed into the reporting by the large companies. There are national contact points that actually I also understand are there to help companies if they wish so. On top of that, this is something which could be very much reinforced further in the context of the upcoming sustainable corporate governance proposal to even actually provide more help and guidance to companies in that respect and build their capacity. On the competitive disadvantage, this is also something I very much agree with. And look, the bottom line is, I'm not sure we can talk about competitive advantage or even level playing field if those companies that are going an extra mile and making an effort to actually and spend extra money to be environmental, have positive or reduce their negative environmental and social impact, or increase their positive environmental and social impact. And on top of that, actually report that information. Obviously, it does cost something, right? So the thing is, if we actually, this is unfair that those companies that go this extra mile, they are actually not sufficiently rewarded for that. And this is why it would be helpful to require that then other companies do that the same. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. And Burčak, just your thoughts on that SME definition question, but
also
quickly, if you want to react.
I think it's the eternal challenge to strike the right balance between simplicity and something reasonable and workable. I agree that our time is well spent on other things when so many parts of the puzzle are being revised. And as one example, by the way, on high-risk sectors, there are some who claim that the entire banking sector would be a high-risk sector. And so, of course, that would be an example of being oversimplistic. So I think we have to always be as simple as we can go, without creating something that doesn't make any sense.
Thanks very much, Burčak. And now, just very quickly, final remarks from each of you. Maybe let's keep them to 20 seconds if possible. If you had any thoughts on or any advice for SMEs that you would like to give now, what should SMEs start doing now or thinking about now to prepare for this trends? Luke, could I start with you? Thanks.
No, I mean, I have to react on what Alexandra said, that she said there are already tools available for SMEs. It is not true. I have the proof. There is a study from the University of Leuven that they are doing, which is saying there are no adapted tools for small and medium-sized enterprises. Point. One should stop to send wrong messages to the public to say that they are available. They are not available at all.
Thanks very much, Luke. Alexandra, do you have any advice for SMEs? What should SMEs start doing now? Just 20 seconds, please.
What they should start doing now? Well, I think they should just start at least thinking about sustainability risks and adverse impacts they are possibly, confronted with. I mean, and at the same time, well, okay, I think if corporate sustainability reporting comes and if it becomes mandatory, I think SMEs will still have a little bit of time, especially that even in the context of the Commission timeline, I think even if the rules would become effective as of 2023, the thing is the first report would be out in 2024. But in any case, I think currently as part of the negotiations, delaying the timeline is being discussed. So, but yeah, I think it's just still important to think about the bigger thing and not only think about compliance, but doing the right thing.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. And Burčak?
I agree that SMEs need to think about what they really need, both in terms of their own impact and also the impact of change on them. And my main advice would be to work with their SME association in their country. And I really look forward as the EBF to working further with SME United in particular, and of course other stakeholders as well. But I think SME United is, and our work together in EFRAC is going to be one of the solutions to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to also thank our fantastic panelists. I think it has been a very, very good conversation. We have clearly seen different positions, but I think we have also seen some clear direction of commonality. I think I noticed a couple of points in there at least. So I think we can maybe continue this discussion at another future Accountants Europe event. So we would be very happy to host you. And at this stage, I'm happy to conclude this session. We are going to have, I believe, a break of a few minutes. But before the break starts, we are going to be displaying a video that presents the main objectives of the Accountants Europe's Green Recovery campaign. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And I have just been instructed to inform the audience that we are going to be resuming at 25 past. So that's in a couple of minutes.
Excuse me, Jens, you said you cannot see my video, but
now I can see you.
You can see me. Perfect. Hello.
Hello. Hello, everybody at the screens at YouTube, and welcome to our second panel. My name is Jens Poll. I'm chair of the Corporate Governance Policy Group of Accountancy Europe. In my real life, I'm audit committee chair in several companies, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to the second panel. And the second panel will focus on sustainable corporate governance and the impact and role of businesses in a sustainable economy recovery. We will discuss the upcoming proposals on sustainable corporate governance, and we will focus on the role of corporate governance in harmonizing the regulatory framework on sustainability. And I'm very happy and delighted to have a very, very distinguished panel here. And I will very briefly introduce to you our four panelists. I will start with Julia Otten. Julia is a policy officer at Frank Bolt's Responsible Companies team and leading the work on the sustainable corporate governance file. She has previously worked on corporate accountability in global supply chains at German Watch. Then we have Anne-Helene Moncellato from ECODA. She is certified public accountant since 2008, and since 2015, she is an independent director at two public companies listed in Europe and US, Euronav and Genfit, where she chairs the Audit and Risk Committee. She's an active member of the French National Association of Directors and of, as I mentioned, ECODA. Prior to that, she was partner with EY in cross-border transaction and listed companies in the US. Then we have Burkhard Eckes. He has over 20 years of professional experience in auditing and advisory of banks and is a capital market specialist. He leads these groups on sustainable finance, ECG network at PwC on national and European level. He is also chairman of the Bank's Working Party of Accountancy Europe. Last but not least, Saskia Brikmont. She's member of the European Parliament and as a member of the group of the Greens European Free Alliance in the European Parliament since 2019. And that's for special interest for this panel discussion. Saskia is serving on the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs and the Committee on International Trade. So thank you very much to all four of you that you have agreed to participate in this panel discussion. And to recall our audience, the expected EC Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative will probably focus on supply chain due diligence, directors' duties, and we know that DG Growth and DG Justice are working together, and there were some timing issues in the last few months, and we are very, very interested for the date of release. As we have heard, it's mid of February, but we will see how it will develop. I would like to start the panel discussion with a short question to all of you, and please give a very brief first impression from your side that you perhaps pinpoint on those 3 or 2 or 4 issues which you would like to see in the upcoming EC corporate governance proposals. So I would like to start with Julia. Please, a very short first statement.
Yes, many thanks, first of all, for the invitation to speak at this panel. I work for Frank Bold-Gervais shortly. If you don't know us, we are a not-for-profit organization, but also a purpose-driven law firm promoting corporate, but also governance accountability or governmental accountability. On the 3 key points, first and foremost, I think we need this proposal of the Commission to introduce the standard of conduct that actually requires companies to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence and prevent harm from occurring throughout the whole value chain. And the Commission should define this behavioral obligation according to the international standards as developed by the UN and also by the OECD. They should put in place effective enforcement measures, including civil liability. And in this context, I find it important to stress that due diligence as a concept is not a compliance exercise that is only about fulfilling procedural requirements, but it's an ongoing and it's a result-oriented exercise whose adequacy is, of course, connected to the aim of preventing those negative impacts and ensuring that these impacts, if they occur, are remediated. So secondly, the proposal, I think, should connect this obligation to carry out due diligence to corporate governance and mainly clarify board obligations in that regard to oversee key sustainability processes. And by that, I mean sustainability reporting, but also due diligence. Why? Because the involvement of directors, all of those who lead and steer companies, is really paramount to ensure that companies are able to take the strategic decisions that is connected to the management of sustainability risks and impacts. And they should be able to integrate them into their corporate strategy. And we think it's crucial because not only to prevent greenwashing, but also to prevent corporate responsibility or compliance departments to operate kind of in a silo within the company. So in a sense, I would say it's a prerequisite for effective reporting and due diligence, preventing it from becoming this mere tick box exercise, if I may call it like that. And my last third point would be that with regard to the environmental and especially climate impacts, the Sustainable Corporate Governance proposal should not miss the momentum to require companies to develop transition plans that are linked to science-based targets. And these objectives should be connected to parts of the variable remuneration. And this is a call that was just supported by 27 directors from major companies. And they published this today. Just wanted to recall, maybe you have seen that. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for this first statement. And Helen, what are your expectations from a corporate governance participant, so to say?
Thank you, Jens, and thank you for inviting me. So on behalf of ECODA, which is the European Confederation of Directors Association. So we at ECODA, we believe, so picking up on Julia's points, so definitely we think that the corporate governance proposal should encourage boards to disclose how they integrate sustainability in their strategy and business model, but without imposing a one-size-fits-all model. Also, it should provide guidance from the European Commission regarding their expectations on ESG and compensation. This has been a regular debate, but what are really the expectations that they would like to see companies comply with? And finally, our third point would be that the proposal should encourage boards to take into consideration stakeholders' interest. However, it should refrain from making boards accountable for every stakeholder interest. As we all know, there can be some divergence, incompatibility between stakeholders' interest, and at some point the board will need to arbitrage between those. So finding the right balance between, consideration for these multiple interests, but at the end of things, boards need to make a decision.
Thank you, Anne-Helene. Burkhard, from the perspective of an auditor in a sector which is quite highly regulated, how you're looking at the new possible legislation we are facing?
Yes, if I may add to what has been already said, 2 points. Also based on my experience, how banks are working this area. And as you rightly said, banks have been, let's say, supervised since a long time. They are regulated industry, so it means governance as such is not a new topic for them. But when I compare this, what I see in non-financial industries, then I would like to say 2 points. The first one is, it seems to be obvious what I'm saying now, but it is extremely important that there is knowledge within the management board and the supervisory board about ESG. I think that's the point, yeah. And when I speak to a lot of these people, then of course they have heard about CFRD, SFDR, at least for the financial services area. They have heard about the taxonomy. They have heard about, oh, there's a lot of things to disclose, yeah, and so on and so forth. They have heard about this, but what does it really mean for the companies they are responsible for, and also they are responsible for supervision? And this, therefore, I think it's a need that in the management board, but also in the supervisory board, from a governance perspective, there must be someone who has knowledge on that. And also, when you discuss in boards about the net zero strategy, yeah, are they really able to steer, to understand this, to push this, yeah, to challenge this, yeah? And that's maybe a thing when we talk about corporate governance, which should be included. And the second one is, I mean, when you speak to shareholders, yeah, then a lot of shareholders are saying the first duty of a listed company is to pay the shareholders. So, and now a company also shall take care of ESG topics, yeah, sustainability and so forth, which does not only mean that you make money out of this. First of all, it comes to additional costs, yeah, which then of course has an impact on dividends and the profitability of a company. So therefore, see there are some management boards are squeezed, yeah, between on one side the need and the clear understanding there is something to do with regard to sustainability. On the other side, that there are shareholders or stakeholders who are mainly looking for dividends. Yeah. So and therefore, I think when we talk about corporate governance and this draft, this let me say the need that that a significant part of corporate governance should be to include a sustainability strategy as part of the business model. So, and then only then you can, let's say, bring also those kind of shareholders on board that they also support, yeah, the management board to move on in this direction.
Thank you, Burkhard. Saskia, now you have heard from different perspective expectations. You will be part of the process, which has not yet started. But what are your expectations and how you are measuring the different aspects?
Thank you very much also for inviting me, and it's good to come after the first interventions. I've taken note, of course, very carefully, and I tend to agree with the three previous speakers, so I will try to be complementary in the dimensions I would like to see in the upcoming legislation. The first one, taking my hat of gender mainstreaming, MEP responsible for gender mainstreaming in the International Trade Committee. I think there's a huge need to stress the gender dimension in the legislation. Because the adverse human rights impacts of corporate activities are not gender neutral. In terms of their economic rights, of their access to land, the right to decent work, unpaid care, domestic work, and also gender-based violence. So misguided measures by companies could reinforce gender inequality. So we need concretely gender disaggregated data, which is currently still highly missing, to make visible such discriminations and threats to women. Include also the reference to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, ILO Convention, related ILO conventions. The second element that I'm also taking from my short experience at the European Parliament is giving a role for the EU delegations. The EU is represented through some 140 EU delegations and offices, and they could really play a role in a proper implementation of due diligence in order to help also the local communities complaining to report wrongdoings of EU undertakings. Of course, the domestic advisory groups that are established in the frame of the FTAs, the free trade agreements, could also be useful in that regard. And I also see a role for the chief enforcement officer, the chief trade enforcement officer, and the single entry point that should fit into this grievance mechanism. So that's another part of what has been said so far. And thirdly, of course, also include sustainable purchasing practices, because in global supply chains, common bad practices include insufficient lead times, last-minute changes to orders, prices that undercut the costs of sustainable production, and fraudulent quality complaints. They, of course, contribute to human rights violations, such as excessive overtime, lack of living wages, living incomes. And so this is something that needs to be taken into account. And this is also crucial, to my view, to introduce civil liability in the legislation. Voilà, thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. I just want also to invite our audience to interfere into this discussion by Slido, because at the end of our panel we will try to add the one or the other question if we have the time. So just to reference to the Slido possibilities. I think we have now an overview, and I would like ask you, Julia, to consider. There are several soft laws and guidelines on sustainable corporate governance and due diligence in the international legal framework, such as the OECD. Thank you for the slide here. So for the audience, you can now see. But Julia, were they enough to drive a change, or how can the new expected directive help, and what is expected to change? So put you please this in a context to the existing resources we have.
Yes, thank you for that question. I would clearly say no, and if I may cite from our research, we see a lot of times that most of the sustainability information is still invisible to corporate decision makers to current day. So if I just cite something that came out yesterday from the World Benchmarking Alliance, they published a new research on their social transformation baseline assessment. Only 7.3% of the companies demonstrate that they meet all the requirements of human rights due diligence. That means that 80% of the 1,000 companies scored 0 on all of these 3 indicators. That's just one research. Our research on 1,000 large EU corporations and their non-financial or sustainability reports shows also that only 14%, I think, yes, of them can actually demonstrate that they integrate those sustainability aspects in their core business strategy, board discussions, and performance incentives. So if we look at these researches, we can see that this information is lacking. And so this new directive, I think, can help if it sets the mandatory obligation for companies to do human rights and environmental due diligence, ensure that it's well enforced. And we should not overlook that this goes, of course, with an entire framework of including as well corporate reporting and sustainable finance, so that there is this incentive as well. So the corporate sustainability governance aspect is a part of the puzzle in that sense, to move beyond what we've seen in the voluntary approaches.
Saskia, would you agree on that description of the status quo, that the existing possible regulations, soft laws, are not sufficient?
Oh, my mic was already on. Yes, I cannot say the contrary. I have to say that voluntary basis initiatives are, of course, taken by many companies. And we also see that coming from them, they are really asking for more regulation, for more intervention, because they need that to reach this level playing field and play in the same game. So, of course, voluntary actions are being taken, and we see it also at SME level, at local level, but we now need to go one step further into regulation, and we really need, as Julia mentioned it, also the enforceability side to be reinforced, and to look into sanction-based mechanisms in order to really have a common approach on this. I maybe will take one or two examples. The first one is the cases of forced labor, which is the most abject form of working conditions, and that remain really high. 16 million people are exploited in the global supply chains, and this figure suffices to demonstrate that voluntary corporate social responsibility, but also, for instance, the OECD principles have not bitten that much over the years. It could be even higher because of the pandemic now. And so a couple of years ago, the ILO estimated that forced labor in the private company generated 150 billion in illegal dollars in illegal profits per year. So I'm joining the first panel. It was mentioned that we need also an involvement of the shareholders, and that sustainability becomes a real business model in order to avoid those, hesitations between, okay, more sustainability or more profits. So a recent study also showed that over a third of companies investigated in high-risk sectors do not show any evidence that they are assessing human rights risks. So 4 out of 5 provide no evidence that they are adopting responsible purchasing practices to mitigate the risk of forced labor in their supply chains. So I have to say from my perspective that I don't understand how many undertakings can pretend to operate due diligence practices, while acknowledging they hardly know and disclose their first tier suppliers. Over 45% only do so, or also the sourcing countries of their raw materials, or do not involve their workers. So I think in order to have a real difference on the ground, yes, we need a stronger legislation.
Thank you, Saskia. Anne-Helene, from your practical experience, I think we have many European jurisdictions where we have some kind of hard laws which are connected to sustainable governance. What is your practical experience? Are they sufficient? Is there a lack of consistency? What is your perspective?
It's a very good question. The EU is currently, with the CSRD, obviously willing to upgrade the framework here in several dimensions. This is building up on the previous legislation. So in terms of corporate reporting in that area, I think many studies have pointed out to a very diverse, varied way of responding by companies. So corporate reporting is not exactly where it should be. First, because it's a tremendous impact. These are many new concepts which needs to be taken on board, making sure that you have a reliable flow of information, that you have identified the key KPIs, meaning really those that will make an impact and are measurable, that you have built up internal control chains so that this information is reliable and really embedded into the information flow, as opposed to being purely something which is done, at the very end for purpose of the corporate reporting on a spreadsheet. So, and this builds up on Julia's point on how is this really embedded into the business model and the decision making, in other words, into the very much culture of the company. So obviously there is a need for action to be more specific and to require companies to have a corporate reporting in that dimension, which is more specific, flowing up from a more systemic approach, looking at the impacts. And here, when we say that we are very much in favor of having expectations, from the EU, it's because sometimes you have, the legislation, and behind that legislation, a certain number of words, which is usually fairly concise to some extent. You need to have interpretation, what are really the expectations that are behind this, because of the, we're many countries in the EU, and different words can be taken differently depending on the country where you are in, the background that you have, etc. So, well, yes, I do feel that some more is needed here.
Burkhard, I would like to use one of your remarks in your introductory short speech, because from the audience we hear the question, how can the interest of shareholders and stakeholders align with the new legislation? I think that is a point you raised earlier. It's a long journey to convince the shareholder of a new emphasis, perhaps I can put it like this.
Yeah, I think if I may take banks as an example, because at least my impression is, if I look at the financial service industry and especially in the bank industry, they are in some way more advanced than maybe the non-financial service industry corporates, as they have a huge pressure from the supervisors. So in the Eurozone, the ECB, and in the other part of the European Union from the national authorities, but also from the European banking authorities. And here it is clearly said that that sustainability and especially the potential impact on climate and environmental risk have to be included in the business model, have to be included in the strategy, has to be included in the calculation of the risks, and has also to be disclosed. And this is a must for the bank. Factually, it is written as a guideline, so it's not, let's say, a legal requirement, but it's a guideline. And if banks are not doing this, then this will be challenged, for example, by supervisors. And what is also quite interesting, that I recently was attending a presentation of a CEO of a large bank, of a large European bank. When he presented his quarterly results, and he started very proudly to say, well, it was a very good quarter, and so on and so forth. And after 10 minutes, the audience, and these were analysts, rating agencies, and other market observers, they said, okay, we understood it was a very good quarter, but now let's use the rest of the time, and it was 1 hour, to talk about what are your ambitions with regards to ESG, and also what are you doing, and what are you doing with the risk, and what are you doing, how do you see the opportunities, and how do you also convince your shareholders that it might sense. And then it was in some way easier for him to say, well, we have on one side the clear pressure from the European Commission, from the supervisors and the regulators, very clear to do so, and it's also a huge opportunity for us. And therefore, I think if you have shareholders who don't care about this, and say, I only want to see money, I only want to see dividends, then it might become really difficult for the management board to move on with this. And therefore, this kind of, and if you want to push those kind of corporates into the sustainability direction, then I think this has to also be included in some way in the regulation and so on. And of course, then what we also see is coming a pressure from the market. More and more corporates are going in this direction. So if you don't do this, then maybe even the customers of those corporates might say, well, this company is not, let's say, sustainable enough or not green enough. So I take a look to other ones. This might also be a pressure which we'll see.
Thank you, Burkhard. We have another question which is very much linked to your observation. And the question is a little bit about the different legal frameworks in the member states whether it's a one-tier, two-tier system, how the competencies in the corporate governance are divided. And Burkhard, you mentioned it with the notion of supervisory boards or non-executive boards. I think the question is how you think, and it's a question to all of you, is the best approach from a European perspective to find the right, how to say, the right point of action, that we are not discussing about the fragmented landscape of different corporate structures and regimes. And on the other hand, we want to get quick progress. I think that is a tension, especially in the corporate governance, where the company law is very different in many jurisdictions. Anne-Helene, you are in different jurisdictions and in different kind of boards. What is your experience with this formal or regulatory restriction?
Thank you, Jens. Here, I think we can build on what happened, for example, with the EU audit reform. You know, there was a huge piece of regulation out there in 2014, and this was dealing with corporate governance, audit committees, and so on. And the principles were laid out in the regulation to be applied in all EU countries after being transposed. Well, there was a piece to be transposed for the directive, but the regulation was immediately applicable. So all countries had to adopt this. Whatever, and you know, adopt, I mean, whatever the background in terms of corporate, you know, structures, legal structures, and so on. So I feel that it's possible to do that, obviously, and ECODA is very much in favor of that. It's always better to have more harmonization because it will make, you know, monitoring and enforcement afterwards easier across the EU. But even without that, we shouldn't let us, you know, being prevented from laying out the principle that we, you know, are aiming at collectively. And then, you know, it will be the iterative process of the member states to adopt on a progressive basis, depending on where they're coming from. So, so we saw that in the EU audit reform. It's not perfect currently, but it's an iterative process, and it does take time. So. That would be my experience.
Thank you, Julia. We have heard now on some part of a good governance in a post-traditional era, so to say. What do you think are the main elements of such a good governance? What would you, as a NGO, as a stakeholder in this process, would recommend as good governance?
Well, I remember that I think it was Commissioner Reynders who actually once said that corporate decision making has to change to a sustainability mindset at all levels. I mean, that's quite ambitious, but I think it essentially boils down to a more holistic and systemic view of your business activities. So because we just cannot afford to overlook human rights and environmental impacts anymore, apart from the fact that the cost for disregarding sustainability issues is even higher in many cases. So I would argue that that's one aspect, and the other one is maybe also a governance culture where complaint mechanisms are more naturally in place, where there is an openness towards critique and making mistakes. So that's a cultural thing, I think, of course, but if we connect it to due diligence, there needs to be a certain culture that enables you to listen and to engage with stakeholders, so you can actually do that in a different way as a company. And yeah, I'm not saying that that's a change that's happening overnight, but I think that's where the good governance direction is going, from my perspective.
Thank you. And a remark from the audience, which goes in the direction you mentioned. It will take time, because it's about how a CEO or a board should react to a shareholders like Terry Smith from Unilever, whom published a letter that Unilever focused too much on ESG. how would you see this remark? I think it's very close to your remark, Burkhard, on a way. Have you made this experience in your work, and how you would recommend to react to such a statement by a shareholder?
Yes, I think to say we focus too much on ESG, I would not agree. We cannot enough focus on ESG. That's very clear. The time is running. On the other side, if I look at the timelines, for example, for the fulfillment of SFDR and CFRD and taxonomy and so on and so forth, that is sometimes nearly impossible to do for the corporates. So, and now you can say, well, doesn't matter, at least I shall start, and then we might see. That's okay. But we should not forget that there are also other huge challenges for corporates and also for the financial services system. Think about impact of inflation, think about of the tensions of countries, think about of the pandemic, and think about of disruption of supply chains and so on and so forth. And if you speak to managers, especially in the financial services industry, then they say, okay, we do that. We focus on that, but there are other risks what we are facing right now, which are more immediate, and that's also something we have to do. Also the investment in digitization and so on and so forth. So therefore, I think it's absolutely clear and good that there is such a huge pressure, but it should not be forgotten. What does it mean for other ones? I'll give you another example. For example, the European Central Bank is planning to do a stress test for the banking industry this year on climate change and environmental risk. I think that's good. But the point is, how can the banks deliver and get all the data? They do not have the data, also due to data protection reasons, but also because these data, there was no need to require them in the past. So now they have to find out what about green investments in companies and so on and so forth. That's one thing. But then the main point is, what are you doing with these results? And if these results leads to, let's say, additional capital needs for the banks right now, or for other, let's say, pressure on the banks, then it might go in a wrong direction. And maybe you know that, for example, the PRA, the British, the English supervisor, they have done last year a stress test on the banking industry regarding climate and environmental risk. And please have in mind, stress test means assume that, for example, in 30 years' time, there is an increase of the heat by 1%. And what does this mean? What happens in 30 years today on your actual business? That is more or less what stress means. And the outcome in the UK, and that's nearly impossible to do, by the way. I mean, how can you do this in a really, let's say, acceptable way? And the impact was just 20 basis points, 0.2% points impact on the capital right now. So I just want to give you this example just to let's say demonstrate that from a bank's perspective, and I think that's the same for other corporates, that this impact is maybe not the highest priority when you look at the risk for the business model. And for that reason, it has to be pushed forward, but it has to be avoided to overscrew the results. And what does it mean? And it also has to be avoided, I think, to give too tough timelines, which are not factually not doable for most of the companies. That is more or less what I would like to say.
I have here the hand of Anne-Hélène. You want to interfere here? Thank you.
Yes, just a quick comment regarding Unilever. I think I remember there was an article in the Financial Times where it all started with Unilever giving a mission statement on the mayonnaise. So I think here it's a good point regarding, how you communicate as a company regarding ESG and sustainability. And to a certain extent, I feel this activist thought that the way they communicated was totally disconnected regarding expectations. It's a mission statement that could be at the level of a company or a division, but at the level of a product. Maybe if they had communicated, on facts, Saskia was mentioning sustainable purchases and so on, so it all boils down, to communication, and on the receiving end, how is this taken by the people to who you communicate. And obviously, for financial reporting, these were primarily the investors, the analysts, the financial community, and here with ESG, it's a much broader community. So you need to pay attention to this. And as far as boards and audit committees, because audit committees will be concerned about that with the upcoming CSRD, you need to prepare for that. You need to make sure that obviously you don't have greenwashing. That's one piece of the equation. But the other piece is really how you communicate interpreted by others. Are you, striking the right points in terms of what's material, what's important, and the format of your communication? When you give objectives, for example, will you be able in the end to provide some follow-up on those objectives, and not, changing objectives and feedback on those, on progress and where you are in the meantime. So this is a key point for audit committees to follow up regarding sustainability reporting. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Hélène. Saskia.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add some elements, because I fully agree again with what has been said, and sustainability cannot be overlooked today. There's a global trend towards more sustainability at all levels, and from the legislator, the legislations are getting more harsh on that at EU level, also to make them compliant with the Green Deal and the global orientation, the climate objectives, and so on. And I really think that it is an opportunity for the economic side enterprises to also comply with those objectives. And many reports show that companies that comply, that are sustainable, perform better than the others. And sustainability is not only about the global supply chain and the production methods and so on. It's also about internal management and how sustainable is the enterprise, the company itself, including the workers that are more productive when they are part of the decision-making process and so on. And I think we have a good example now with what is happening in the US, and workers that are fed up with the way they are exploited and that they want something else. And I think this is part of a global, global trend. And finally, I wanted to also point out two reports, such as the Global Risk Report of the World Economic Forum, for instance, pointing out that the main risks are related to the loss of biodiversity, to climate change, and so on. And so I think there's a huge need to integrate those dimensions also, because not being compliant with those objectives and not being sustainable will imply even higher costs in the near future. So I think for business models, they have to become sustainable in order to be viable.
Thank you, Saskia. Well, I have another question from the audience. What kind of responsibilities should we expect from corporations in order to combat human rights violations in their supply chain? Julia, may I ask you, from a perspective as a lawyer and representing perhaps third parties in such conflicts or discussions, what is your perspective?
Well, it generally goes back to, I think, the first point I made at the very beginning. So basically, it's about knowing what are the main impacts of your business activities. We call this salient human rights issues. So what are like the big issues in terms of your businesses that affect people and the environment with what you're doing? And this holds true for the whole supply chain. So I was quoting the international standards in that regard. That's the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidance on that. They've been in place for over 10 years by now, and they've developed a very good and also continue to develop a very practical way of how to apply this to the company. There are certain steps that you should take: identifying the risks, addressing them, providing remuneration, and so on and so forth. So that's the process that should be in place. You have to engage with stakeholders, so really listen to, and many companies, first and an easy step is unions, trade unions. You have to engage with your workforce. That's a very first move that you can make if you start with this issue and with this on this journey. Yeah, so I think there is a very good orientation out there, and then I could go into more details, but from the very general and broad understanding, that's what is expected. So it doesn't only concern your own business, but it concerns your business activities, and in that sense also your business relations with partners, with suppliers, that you have to be able to know and overlook and manage.
Thank you, Julia. I would like to raise the attention to another point which is very much discussed and controversially discussed and I would ask you, Saskia, how necessary it is to introduce also civil liability for environmental and social damage being deriving from corporate actions and the corporate liability, but also the liability of directors, which is also discussed. And we talked about enforcement too. What are your suggestions or expectations in this respect?
Yes, indeed. I think it is important to introduce civil liability in the legislations. Undertakings of companies should be held liable for their wrongdoings or omissions that led to, it has been said, violations, for instance, of human rights, or also that caused damage to the environment. I think it has been thought as such, unless they can prove otherwise, and that they acted in compliance with their due diligence obligations. And that's in line with the UN GPs. Conducting due diligence should not automatically absolve undertakings from liability for the harm done. Also, because of the significant differences between member states, legal and administrative provisions on due diligence, and this relates also to what has been said before, it is essential to prevent future barriers to trade stemming from this divergent development of national laws. And the sanctions, I think, should be proportionate, but also dissuasive and based on the severity of misconduct, without being limited, for instance, to severe human rights harms, as advocated by some business federations. It would de facto make most other harms legally permissible. But the question is, what would a non-severe human right harm be, for instance, and who would be in charge to determine what they are? And besides being ethically unacceptable, it also opens the way to legal uncertainty that everyone wants to avoid in such an approach. So also, what should be introduced in the future legislation is that in case where several companies are involved, then the legislator should ensure the possibility, for instance, of joint liability among several parties, which is not possible for the moment. So definitely, this legislation should introduce also civil liability in order to, yes, to have this enforcement level.
Thank you, Saskia. I would like to have some thoughts about the risk management coming out of that and bringing the audit committee. And Helen, you mentioned earlier as a player in this game. How do you see the role of an audit committee? And we have heard from Burkhard there's the need of having enough experts understanding this. How is your observation, the status quo, and what should be developed in due time concerning these issues?
Thank you, Jens. Just before that, responding to Saskia, I totally agree that due diligence should not exonerate. In the US, with Sarbanes-Oxley, there has been many instances of enforcement where the SEC has said it's not because you have internal control that you have it. Internal control must work. And with the upcoming whistleblowing directive in the EU, it's not just implementing whistleblowing, it's how you communicate about the whistleblowing hotline and will it achieve the desired effect of people from everywhere in the company reporting on corporate wrongdoing. So totally agree with that. However, it's very difficult to a certain extent when you speak about supply chain to have some system of civil liability, which is outside of the group, obviously, without having, a strong possibility for internal reporting first, so that at board level, because you have management, which is very much aware or should be very much aware of how things are working at the company and the group, and you have the board, and the board is, obviously having a duty of care, must meet with people outside from the senior management, but they're not there, the full time in the company, and without really, the whistleblowing system, which would allow for treatment by the board of this whistleblowing first, before imposing civil liability. I think it's a very important piece of the discussion. So then moving to your question, Jens, on how can audit committee contribute. So really first regarding sustainability is a responsibility of the board. And very much at the very beginning, you had some companies establishing, sustainability committees where one could have the impression that they would park the ESG topic into these committees. And now the more we look at it and the more we discuss about it, you can see that ESG for, I would say, good players have moved from being part into these ESG committees to being, really a way of functioning at the board. Starting with the board is responsible for the strategy and regarding sustainability, making sure that the strategy incorporates totally the sustainability element, moving to our discussion previously regarding how is it embedded in the business model. Now you have the audit committee with the CRSD, which will be in charge of reviewing corporate reporting regarding sustainability. So moving from the financial angle, the role of the audit committee has been transposed to non-financial reporting, but you also have many other committees, so not statutory committees, but for example, compensation committee will be, in charge from reviewing how ESG articulates with compensation, but also more broadly, I feel in the future will take charge more and more about those other aspects regarding, HR at the company. When we were speaking about gender discrimination, equality does not equate fairness, for example. All these topics, somebody mentioned at some point, your human right due diligence, it's you have a risk here. So if you have a risk committee, that could be taken by the risk committee, that could be taken by the compensation and large vision of the compensation committee to review how the company has put processes around these, how they are monitoring, how do they assess those processes to make sure that they really have an impact. So regarding audit committees and sustainability, it's not just purely audit committee, but more, how the different committees of the board will really take these matters on board and do their oversight as part of their duty of care.
Thank you, Anne-Hélène. Any views from the panel to the role of non-executive or supervisory committees in this process? Not at that stage. So I would like to raise two questions from the audience. The first one is, can legal certainty for companies be ensured in the due diligence legislation? So there's no, the listener is questioning, there's no clear definition, prioritization needed when addressing adverse impacts. How can this problem be faced and mitigated? How is there any view on the panel? I see Julia, you want to interfere?
Yes, happy to take on that one, but the others, please add to that. We are in need of legal certainty on this, but we've seen a soft law development for over 10 years. And as I already said, there is a very solid approach to these issues, such as prioritization. So you can't make due diligence in a one size fits all or like a super sector specific way. So there is a middle ground that you have to find in defining these processes. But what we need is that these processes and these standards of conduct are defined well, so companies know what is expected. And I think in that sense, yes, we can get legal certainty by a good definition that is building upon these international standards that have been around for 10 years and that companies know, at least those who've been engaging voluntarily on this. So there is the moment to transmit this and transpose this into law and into legislation, and there is a way of doing this. We are seeing this at national level in legislation in France and in Germany for the human rights due diligence part. So it's a question of harmonization as well for the EU to set this standard of conduct right and go about defining these issues.
Thank you, Julia. Any other views? Saskia.
It goes along with what Julia just said. I think that legal uncertainty would be not to act at EU level now and to have a proper EU legislation because we need harmonization, we need this level playing field, and we need also to work with our partners in the partner countries. I see it through the negotiation of the free trade agreements, for instance. We need to work on the sustainability standards together. It's not only a EU matter, it's an international matter. So we need to work at the World Trade Organization level also on sustainability of companies. And of course, we need to act at EU level because this is somewhere we can directly influence. But what we see, and I don't think it's a bad thing, but I think the EU has to accompany that through EU legislation, is that there's a multiplication of national legislations. The Netherlands are moving forward. France, Belgium is also thinking about it while saying, okay, we're waiting for the EU. We don't really know, but in Belgium, for instance, we have also different layers of institutions and different governments. Some are willing to go faster than others. And so this would create a lot of uncertainty. So I really think that now the moment has come to have a EU legislation that brings more harmonization and perspectives, long-term perspectives.
Thank you, Saskia. And I think that was a very good final word. And I'm sorry that we have now to conclude our panel discussion because we are at the end of our time slot. So thank you to all of you for your interesting input and your participation, for your thoughts and insights. And thank you to the audience for all the input. And I think we have not yet discussed all the aspects we could discuss. It's a longer session we would have to have, but I think we have highlighted some aspects of a possible new regulation from the European Commission, and we are very much looking forward for continuing our discussion when we see black and white letters, and then we can discuss whether they are feasible, whether they are proportionate, etc. So thank you for your participation. And now we have a 5-minute break till 12:30, and then we will continue with the public sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bisbee. I'm a senior manager at Accountancy Europe, and I would like to welcome you to the public sector session of Green Recovery Counts. Of course, as mentioned previously in the session, please feel free to ask questions throughout the session on Slido. As mentioned earlier by MEP Hataula, the public sector has important and multiple roles to play in sustainability matters and achieving net carbon zero. In a previous event at Accountancy Europe, we have discussed how the greening and sustainability reporting of the public sector's own activities. In this session, we will look at another role the public sector has, influencing the private sector and citizens to change their behaviour through a combination of regulation, taxes and incentives. It is to discuss these policy areas and what role Europe could and should play in them that I'm joined by my guests, Rosa Aldea Busquet and Marie Lamuel. Rosa is the Deputy Director General in DG Budget and Accounting Officer of the European Commission. Her many responsibilities include the budgetary discharge procedure, relationships with the European Court of Auditors, Treasury Management, accounting, financial reporting, budget implementation of the multi-annual financial framework, and recovery of monies due to the Commission. Rosa has been a key actor in modernising the European Commission's financial accounting systems and developing a stronger and harmonised framework. The financial statements of the Commission are now based on the International Public Sector Accounting Standards and have maintained a yearly clean bill of health on their reliability from the European Court of Auditors. Thanks to this success, the Commission is now considered a leading reference worldwide for accountability, transparency and accounting in the public sector. Rosa, we welcome you. Marie joined Bruegel in September 2021 as an affiliate fellow on the macroeconomics of decarbonisation. Her work aims at understanding the economic transformations that will accompany a transition to net zero emissions and at proposing a policy framework that ensures an efficient and socially just transition. Prior to joining Bruegel, Marie did a postdoc at Tilburg University, where she worked on the effects of innovation on productivity growth and on technical standard setting. She maintains her affiliation with the Tilburg Law and Economics Centre and continues to teach economic growth in the Master of Economics. She also has prior experience at the OECD, estimating the value and growth potential of investments in intangible assets. Welcome, Marie. We'll start off with a kind of scene-setting question initially, which I'd like to ask both to Rosa and Marie. We have heard that the public sector is important, but in your opinion, how important is the public sector and all of its guises to sustainability issues and achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions? Rosa, if you'd like to start.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everybody. And thank you to have organized this kind of discussions, because it's a topic that is very important. I think the first thing to say that I would like to say that the role of the public sector is very important, and I think that we can all agree. And this public sector at all the levels of the public sector, a very high level until the very local level of the public sector. I would like to start saying some words that said our president, the president of the Commission, Mrs. van der Leyen, that the climate change, it needs to be considered now as the biggest challenge that we have in our time. And that we have the problem of the COVID and we have found a vaccine, but a vaccine against the climate change is impossible. And that we need to act. And I think here it's this reality that the public sector needs to be the leading role, needs to be coordinating. And for us, the public sector needs to put the ambitions and to really find what are the objectives that we want, what are the targets, and then to canalize a little bit the finance that we would like, that it's necessary for this transformation. I think also the public sector has an important role to monitor to monitor how it's evolving, and it has also an important role of major facilitator of this important transformation. The public sector has also a role to identify opportunities for many sectors of our economy, but also to identify what are the aspects, sector, regions, communities that are more vulnerable to all this transformation, because it's not the case that everybody will have opportunities of this transformation. There are sectors and communities that will suffer more, and the public sector has an important role to identify and to find solutions to accompany these sectors and citizens in order that nobody is staying behind the others, that we need to progress all together. I think that it's the main messages that I would like to pass.
Yep. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to participate in this discussion. I think my introductory comments are also going to probably cut across many of the points just raised previously. But I would like to start with essentially setting the scene in terms of, what are the 3 pillars of action that need to be undertaken by our economy to transition to, deep decarbonization, to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So there's really 3 major areas of emissions that comprise the bulk of emissions and where we really need to focus. So the first one is turning to a low carbon electricity grid. So that requires removing from the grid coal power generation, also gas and oil ones, although not necessarily at the same speed, and then deploying in a massive amount renewable energies. And so that requires, both a lot of investment coming from either public or private sources, but also smart legislative framework, smart regulations to try to get these complex markets, energy markets, to shift the investment effort towards low carbon technologies. So the second big area of emissions is transport. And here the challenge is to essentially electrify transport once, or, taking into account the going effort to make electricity low carbon, to then electrify as many uses as we have. And so helping end users, consumers, switch their transport needs to electric vehicles, for example, will require incentives for households, but also investments in some public infrastructure, such as charging stations. And then finally, the final third source of emissions that is really should be targeted is to improve energy efficiency, and that mostly affects heating costs for domestic housing. And as the energy crisis of this current winter is reflecting, our economies are really not ready to face these challenges. So bearing in mind sort of those 3 objectives that we need to achieve, there's really 2 roles that the public sector can play. The first one is in mobilizing financing. And so there's estimates, for example, by the European Commission that all of these, 3 actions plus everything else will cost about 360 billion euros per year, in addition to existing investments made in infrastructure, energy infrastructure or transport. So that represents about 2% of GDP, which, it's depending on whether one considers that to be a large amount or not. I kind of want to just give another headline figure to put this in perspective. So for decades now, the European Union has had the target of having 3% of GDP as R&D spending, and that target has been consistently missed. So putting this 2% additional investments in the energy transition, it's going to be a considerable effort. And then in addition to the financing, the role of the public sector is really to set the rules of the game, to set the legislative framework. And the single most important contribution that the EU has done is really to set up the European trading scheme, because to address the issue of emissions, putting a price on carbon is one of the most fundamental policies that can be undertaken. And as seen by the slow progress and the teething problem that the EU ETS system has had, and how it's taken well over a decade to finally reach a point where it seems to be working, just shows that some of these regulatory initiatives really happen over the long run. And so just to finish off, I think the EU definitely has a role to play in terms of being a sort of global standard setter, and a lot of the regulatory innovations made in the next couple of years at EU level have the potential to then spill over globally and help many other countries with their energy transition.
Thank you very much, Marie. You mentioned Europe there. Why Europe? What is it that we can do at a European level that member states can't do on their own?
Yes, my first intervention was more on what the public sector can do. Now, why Europe? It's important that Europe has this reaction at the European Union level. The European Union is a union of 27 member states, and that you know very well. The majority of these member states are not very big. We have Europe wants to fix, as I said before, it's fixing the real objectives. The consequences of climate change, they don't have borders, are for everybody. And when the European Union is working together, it's working in a very coordinated manner, we are stronger. And it's easier to find solutions. It's easier to fix what are the objectives. And I think it's an opportunity to have Europe now to lead in the world this transition. And I think this sustainability is one aspect in that the European Union would take the lead and then help the rest of the world. It's important that the objective that Marie also has explained that have been fixed already, neutrality in 2050, a reduction by 55% of the emissions by 2030, that are important objectives that have been fixed. If we are fixing that by country, and the majority of the countries they don't have the same objective, it would be very difficult, like a continent we are advancing. But at the same time, at the European Union, we can put already the legislation that it's necessary to advance. We can start preparing the finance, as already Marie said, we have a lot of investment that needs to be done. It's a way that the European Union can canalize public investment, but also to give the facilities to the private sector to come to this area of investment. We can use our MFF, we can use the financial instruments, we can use budgetary guarantees. There are many of aspects that at the level of the European Union exist and can facilitate a good cooperation between the public and private sector. At the same time, at the level of the European Union, we can do a better coordination at international level in all the forums, that is the FCD, the G20, G7, and so on. And also, it's important to think that at the level of the European Union, we can have a much better collaboration between the member states in all the areas, not only on legislation and objective, but also on research, innovation, services, to find solutions to the problems of supply chain, on infrastructure, on knowledge. There are plenty of areas that if we are working together, we will be much efficient. And at the same time, we have already prepared a very good initiatives at the level of the European level, and I think it's important that they are known and they are very well followed up by at all the levels, because it's an important aspect, an important effort that it's been doing at the level of the European Union, and needs to be much better knew by everybody. And that is an aspect that maybe we can discuss later, but it's an aspect that for me, it's we are doing a lot. It's very important, but it's really new. We will discuss.
Thank you, Rosa. And Marie, do you see a role for Europe in this in the sustainability?
Yes, definitely. So I just want to start with a headline number. So the economy of all EU countries together produce 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If we add the emissions coming from the products that we import from other countries, that jumps by a few percentage points to about 12 or 13%. So just to say that even if Europe manages to fully decarbonize its economy, it will matter, but it won't solve the global problem of climate change. And so only to reemphasize that national level initiatives would have even smaller impacts on what essentially is a global problem. So, firstly, given the scale of what we're talking about, there really is no alternative but to work at EU level. And then the second point I want to make is precisely by working at this level, it allows to think about redistribution or compensating particular sectors, countries, regions that might be paying a higher price for this against other regions or sectors that are going to be having windfalls. And so the example I want to give is, for example, again, the European emissions trading scheme. The fact that it covers the European economy means that it allows for a much more efficient allocation of abatement, in a sense that it's the countries, sectors, companies where abating emissions is going to be cheaper for them who are going to do it first, and then allowing the ones for whom there are fewer alternatives to maybe have a bit more time to invest in reducing emissions. So firstly, just because of the scale of the problem, and secondly, because addressing this at EU level allows for some, redistribution across the continent, I think it's definitely the more appropriate scale to deal with this problem.
Thank you very much. We've seen from your CV, Rosa, that you seem to be at the heart of practically everything financial in the EU. So in your view, what are the main initiatives to promote public sector sustainability at a European level? And where do you think the EU is having the biggest impact on its fight against climate change?
As I said, there are plenty of initiatives. For me, the first one is the objective that have been identified, agreed on the 27 member states. That is the ambition to have neutrality for 2050 and a reduction by 2030 of 55%. I think this is the first. That is the global picture, and it's the most important contribution. Then all the legislative package that we have proposed that will help to all the European Union to go in this transformation, because it's a lot of things that needs to be done. And this legislative process will allow also to member states to introduce the reforms and the investments that are necessary. The third point is the carbon prices, and this mechanism that Marie said, the ETS, the European Trading Scheme. What is this system that is working well and finally has also helped a lot to the reductions of the CO2? You need to pay to have the right to pollute. And that is a system that has been working for several years, and now there will be extended to other sectors like maritime, roads, buildings. And it's a system that allows to recover also investments, and all this money will help to the climate transition. And that is an instrument that is there, will be improved, will be extended, and is helping a lot. And another one is that in the Next Generation EU, the climate transition is in the heart of the Next Generation EU. You know that the Next Generation EU is the response of the European Union to the COVID, but not only to the COVID. The objective is to prepare to recover Europe of this crisis, but also to prepare the Europe for the future, to be well prepared and to be more resilient. And in this objective of the Next Generation EU, the green transition is at the heart, with an important investment of an objective of 37% of all the investments needs to go to the green transition. And that, I think, is very also important. And maybe I cannot say all, but maybe also to say something that we are very motivated on the green bonds. We have issued already the fair issuance of green bonds, and it's an instrument also to help to canalize the investments in the expenditure side to everything that is related to the green transition. That is a very high-level picture, not going into the details, but for me are very important aspects that at the high level of the European Union we are leading in this transition. And maybe one thing that I already said before, but it's important, is that we want to advance all together, and we have proposed solutions for, as I said, for sectors, regions, or citizens that will have consequences that will be more vulnerable to the green transition. And I think that is also an aspect that is very important of the European solution.
Thank you very much, Rosa. You mentioned the issue of green bonds. What do you believe the main challenges involved that the EU will face in doing so?
Well, green bonds, it's a challenge. Maybe before saying the challenges of the green bonds, I would like to say why we are using bonds. As I said, Next Generation EU is the answer of the European Union for this crisis. It's a package of 800 billion on the table. It's a package that needs to be financed. And at this moment in time in the European Union, it was impossible to finance all of that with the current own resources that we have. And it was a very innovative way to finance this package, this ambitious package, is going to issue bonds in the financial markets. And that is the innovative of the Next Generation EU. This emission of bonds will be later be reimbursed via the multi-annual financial framework via the own resources. But at this moment in time, we are financing all the solution, all the initiative investments in Next Generation EU via issue of bonds in the financial market, as I said, 800 billion. At the same time, the European Union has put as an objective that the 30% of this global package of bonds will be green bonds. That means around 250 or something like that of green bonds. Challenge, well, there are many. First, it's a new product, and I think that everything that is new, it's important. It's a challenge. Also, for me, it's the market. It's enough demand in the market, because finally, when you are coming with a new financial product, it's necessary to be sure that you are confident that it will be a request. And we have discussed a lot with all the investors at all the levels. We have issued the first emission of green bonds in October, 12 billion, and it was a success. And it was said that it's really an important demand on these products. It was another issuance some 1 week before in Spain, and it was the same. It's really a product that is very well demanded by the investors. And I think, but that is something, it's not only now that we want a demand, we want that this demand continues along the time, and also that the market on this product is very liquid. And the third challenge that I would like to say is that green bonds is to finance green expenditure. And now we need the challenge to ensure that these green bonds are really to finance green expenditure. And we have put in place a lot of mechanisms to be sure that we can ensure the markets that our investments are for the green transition.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Marie, you mentioned the three main sectors you think are going to have to change, will definitely have to change. That's a big challenge. We're going to require innovation. So what can the public sector, especially at the EU level, do to actually foster innovation in carbon-free solutions?
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting question, because it's really, in my view, one of the sort of, it tends to be a little bit brushed under the carpet. But so to achieve, this decarbonization, there are still plans to roll out or implement technologies that don't actually really exist, or are still very much on the drawing board, or haven't proven their commercial viability. And so in order to reach these objectives, there just needs to be a lot more innovation. So I'm just going to give a few examples of areas where really we really need to kickstart the innovation machine, or launch it much faster. Firstly is the issue of energy storage. So the massive rollout of renewables on the electricity grid is currently the bottleneck is energy storage. Because these renewable energies are very intermittent, and we just haven't solved that puzzle. And so there's innovation in many areas, in battery storage, in non-battery storage. There's also the hydrogen route that's being explored. But at the moment, none of these solutions are viable. And I feel like we're a little bit at the stage that we were 10 years ago with renewables, where they were expensive and not very efficient. But then with sustained effort over a decade, there has been just so much technological progress in that domain that the costs have been brought down. And today, deploying these renewables is commercially efficient, and so now we need to do the same thing with energy storage. And then there's the harder nuts to crack, which are there's certain sectors where we just don't really know exactly what a or a low carbon version of them would be, and so mostly in maritime and air transport, there really still needs to be quite a lot of new ideas that are being brought to the fore. So there's experimentation in synthetic fuels, there's experimentation in electrification of these sectors, but really we just don't know what is going to be the most efficient way of decarbonizing these sectors, and that's why we just need an environment that fosters this. And so I just want to bring in some academic research that has looked at the amount of patenting in renewable energies compared to patenting in fossil fuel energy, and correlates it with the price of fossil fuels. And they've basically shown that the shale gas boom in the US, which really slashed the cost of oil, led to a significant decrease in the amount of patenting in green technologies. And so here really the public sector has a role to play, firstly in ensuring that there's a carbon price that sets the right incentives for the market itself to redirect its innovation effort in the direction of sustainability. And then the second involvement of the public sector is just direct funding of innovation, because there's also quite a lot of academic evidence which shows that essentially a lot of the innovation is just too risky for many private actors to undertake. And so the public sector really has an important role to play here in just funding a lot of this effort. And then finally, the other sorts of policies that are beneficial for innovation, which might not necessarily be evident at first sight, is to have a whole market structure that's promoting competition. And so here the role of competition policy comes in. And again, this is an area where the EU has direct jurisdiction, just to ensure that there's a level playing field, that the startups that do come up with these innovative ideas, they can scale up and gain market shares to compensate for their successful innovation. And so here there's really quite a lot to do.
Oh, that was very, very, very informative. I think maybe 20 months ago, the population was sat around appreciating the lack of traffic on the roads, the clean air in the sky, not having to commute. We're now seeing perhaps a bit of a turn against green policies in respect of things like the gas shortage, gas prices increases, fears about investments already made. What can the public sector do to ensure the social and political acceptability of achieving net zero, Marie, in your opinion?
It's a very good question, but very difficult. I think, as I said at the beginning, it's very important to explain to the citizen. As I said at the beginning, we are convinced that we are confronted to maybe to the major challenge in the world, and that at the level of European Union high level, it's very well understood. But I think this message it's not passing through all the channels and going to the citizen. I think public sector has a real need to improve the communication and the awareness. But it's one of the aspects that the public sector is not very good. Public sector decide, take actions, take all the objectives, but it's not good. In general, it's my personal opinion. In general, it's very difficult that the message why we are doing that. Because if not, there will be a lot of consequences on the citizen. And one of the people are now linking the price of the energy with all this ecological transition. And I think it's very important to, at any level of the society, to pass clear message, but very clear, because sometimes we are too complicated. And that is a little bit the role of all of us, that we understand what is the challenge, what are being doing, could be the impact. And I think I would request that a lot of communication, a lot of pedagogic explanations, even starting that on the school, because this transition is not for 1 year or two, this transition is forever. And I think it's an aspect that would be also included in the school, in the medias, and the citizens have to understand why we are doing that and what are the consequences also for them. And that therefore it's for the future. It's not maybe not for today, but it's for the next generation. That is the name of this project that we have put in place, Next Generation EU. We are working now to have a better world for the new generation. How to do that? It's difficult. And I think it needs a lot of brain and not a lot of thoughts of all the participants, how to communicate better. Because if the citizens is not convinced, and you see all the demonstrations in the streets, in the medias, it will be very, very difficult to advance. It will be very difficult for all the governments to put in place of the measures. And that is the question. For me, it's education, awareness, communication, but in a very clear way. Public sector or the specialists, we always communicate very complicated, with details, with figures. No, we need to be more using the new technologies, maybe this, I don't know, but something needs to be done. That is my message to all of you. Try to collaborate and help on this important mission, because it's our future in the middle.
So, Marie, the public sector is not very good at communication. Do you have any suggestions or proposals that could improve this?
Sort of. So I think I want to add to what Rosa just said, that so in addition to communicating about the objective and why we're doing this and sort of the responsibility towards future generations, I think there's one element that needs to be really taken into account when designing policies, is that it's perceived as fair amongst the current generation. So all of us here today are going to have to make efforts, but certain segments of society feel like they're always making an effort, whereas some other segments of society, let's say, are less held accountable for some of the their actions. And so I think, I'm French, and so the Gilets jaunes is, always comes up when talking about this. And I think that was their main, the main complaints with this movement was, firstly, there was sort of an existing economic paradigm, and where people just made decisions about where to live and trading off housing, real estate prices versus commuting time, and then from one day to the next, that situation was changed, and they just didn't have the time or the available resources to adapt to this new economic paradigm. So there was the first element of unfairness in that sense, that why did you pull the carpet from under our feet so suddenly? And then the second point where I think they perceived it as unfair was, these are sort of low to low middle income households who also have the feeling that they're paying their fair share to all of societal costs, not necessarily just the energy transition, and feel like some other segments of society aren't paying their fair share. And so there's also that element of fairness that needs to be taken into account. And so, insisting that this is a just transition, I think is crucial, just to get the message properly across. And so then I just want to add another point in terms of, so I don't really have any solutions, but I just have more challenges or points where I think this might actually bite a little bit, and that we need to be conscious of. And so, I see really the social consequences being on two dimensions. One is on consumption. So, this winter really exemplifies that there are quite a large segments of society that aren't ready to face a higher price for fossil fuel energy. And the problem with, the winter of this winter is that we're unready. We haven't made the investments. There's very little scope for switching out of fossil fuels into other non-carbon energies. And so the policy solutions for this winter have been, either to reduce taxes on fossil fuels, but from an economic theory perspective, that's just really not what we should be doing. And then the other approach is to just hand out financial aid for vulnerable households, which makes more economic sense, but raises the issue of fiscal sustainability in the long run, right? This is not really something that we can do. As Rosa said, this transition is going to last a generation, and we can't continue to just buy our way through higher energy prices. And then the second aspect on which certain households are going to really feel the effect is on labor market opportunities. So there's the first round effect that there's certain occupation and industries that are just going to have to disappear. I think everyone accepts that. The problem is that they're highly concentrated in certain communities, and so that's going to raise very important issues, especially because the opportunities created by the transition are going to happen geographically elsewhere, right? The windy, sunny places of Europe are not on top of coal mines. And so there's this sort of friction that needs to be addressed. But I think then there's a second effect, which we tend to forget about, is precisely, it's the interaction between this consumption and this labor market, in the sense that the households that, because higher energy prices creates a budget crunch for many households, that kind of has negative effects on GDP growth, especially in the short run. And these lower income households tend to be employed in sectors that are really responding to demand. So logistics, retail, client-facing industries. And so actually we might be facing the danger that there's a feedback loop through the economy, that higher energy prices leads to lower demand and lower consumption, which itself leads to lower employment opportunities precisely for these households. So I don't have any solutions, but what I'm saying is we might be faced with quite some important challenges, and I think we need to be aware of these when thinking about designing these policies.
Thank you. Talking of important challenges, it's almost a contractual obligation for us to talk about coronavirus, especially as it actually feels now like it will still be around in 2050. Can I ask you both if you think there have been valuable lessons learned from the coronavirus crisis, in particular how public sector entities dealt with that? Is that something that we can apply to dealing with the greenhouse gas emissions problem? Do I have any takers for that question?
I think in front of a crisis, there are always lessons learned. And the response to the COVID crisis, maybe I can say that has shown that the public sector can react quickly, united, coordinated, even if at the beginning was difficult, but we have succeeded and we have taken at the level, for example, of the European Union, a lot of initiatives that are maybe well or not well known, but there are plenty of good examples of initiative. But at the same time, maybe to say that also with this crisis of the COVID shows that the structural problems caused because there were not enough investment during many years cannot be solved in a moment in time where we have in front of a very an immediate crisis. And that is, we have done a lot, but if the health systems of the countries were not good, it was not now that it is possible to do all the investments in the health system of the different countries. And I think that it's a very important lesson because to fight the consequence of the climate change, as we said, I and also Marie, it's forever. And we need already to find all the structural things that we need to do. It's not because tomorrow we will have a flood in Germany or another consequence that is very punctual that we will react to this. We need to, the lesson is that we need to act in a very structural way, and the effort need to be very structural, because if not, it will be very, very difficult for this objective. And I think maybe that is the most important lessons, that we cannot react always to what we have in front of. We need to react in a very long-term perspective, in a structural manner, and that is maybe the most important lesson.
Marie, would you like to comment?
So my answer to this question is actually just to repeat what Rosa said about the instrument, this completely new instrument that was created during the crisis at EU level, the Next Generation and the Recovery Fund, which then launched the first time EU borrowing and the issuance of bonds. So my takeaway, well, firstly, we have an instrument that was designed to address the COVID economic crisis, which was already anticipated to take into account the need to transition, and which maybe looking in the future, when the COVID crisis has been a little bit resorbed, to keep going with that instrument, to use it for the energy transition. And then the second lesson from that is really that it seems that our infrastructure or institutions were able to answer to this crisis, and so that kind of gives me a bit of hope that we might be able to address this second crisis as well.
A bit of hope is always nice. It seems to be in short supply at the moment. We have a question from the audience. I'd be interested to see if you have opinions on this. Which part or sector of the public sector do you believe will face the most challenges to a sustainable transition? Do we have any takers?
Well, I think I would just sort of answer a little bit. So my feeling is that the COVID crisis has weakened, both our economies, but also the public budgets, and that's going to take quite a while to resorb the shock. And so I think the energy transition or the sustainability transition will require quite a lot of these public investments, as we sort of already discussed in the beginning. And so in that sense, there's going to be quite a lot of financial efforts that were going to need to be made. And again, I don't think we're having the right discussions in terms of where really is this funding going to come from, and is it going to create problems in the long run?
in general, is also the sectors that will be more challenged for this is all the sectors that are using or are a high level of CO2 emissions. That it will be all the sectors. It's not public or private, but it's the sectors that will be more difficult for this transition. And at the level of public sector, it's really to coordinate in a very articulate way all these enormous transition, because it's not something that is punctual. It's enormous that we have in front of us. It's investment in a lot of sectors, and everything needs to be very well integrated and articulated, and to find the finances. This aspect of the public sector, all these departments, ministers in the public sector, that they have to ensure all this transition, it will be really very, very well also impacted at the level of the way that they are working, the initiatives they will propose, the imagination to have. What we said, Next Generation EU, it's a very good instrument, it's very innovative, but all of that requires a lot of discussions, thoughts, and then to have a very good coordination. And I think that it's what will be from now in the years coming. The public sector will need always to work in this very holistic way to have holistic solutions, and that is something that it will be also impacted the way that we are working.
Thank you. Well, our time's coming to an end. If I could just ask you kind of very briefly, what would you say to someone who would say, we just can't afford sustainability? Fiscal sustainability is more important now than environmental sustainability. Does anyone have any pithy and illuminating response to that sort of question?
Well, I think it's something that it's easy to hear, no? That we need first fiscal sustainability, and the rest it's coming later. For me, these two objectives are not necessarily inconsistent, but maybe to say that if we are not moving and improving for this sustainability, we don't have a future fiscal sustainability, because it's a little bit a circle, no? It's good that we have very good public finance, but we don't have, if we are not investing in the future, we don't have a future. And that, I think, it's this message and narrative that needs to be very well explained, and at the same time that investing in the future for this sustainability will bring also opportunities, and will help also the fiscal sustainability. It's in the two ways that in the two directions that this relation is doing, but each person is focused in one part, in one direction only, and I think we need to complete the circle, how one thing interacts in the other, and the other interacts in the first one.
Thank you. Marie, some final thoughts?
Yeah, so I would say really this is a whole societal effort. So I think there's going to be some necessary public investments in certain public infrastructure, but also there's a need for a lot of investments within the private, between private actors. And so there's many fiscally zero cost regulations, decisions that can be made that will imply redistribution amongst actors of society, but that don't really impact the fiscal situation of the public budgets. So, for example, the decision to ban the sale of thermal cars by 2035 does not cost public finances. It does imply quite a lot of costs for car manufacturers and consumers, but it doesn't cost public finances. And so I think it's a balancing act of finding the right policy instruments. Some of them require disbursing from the public purse, but many others are really just about setting up the right framework conditions to just get the rest of the economy and society to go on board with this. And so I would finish on the optimistic note that I think it is affordable in the sense that even though we don't necessarily know exactly what it's going to look like, I think humanity has a capacity to invent interesting solutions to problems. And so I think we can rely on that to bring us forward.
So another positive note to finish on. Thank you both very much for an extremely informative session, and thank you to the audience for your kind attention. I will now hand over to our CEO, Olivier Boutelis-Taft, for his closing thoughts on this very interesting event. Olivier?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everybody. I think this was a very interesting event. I have to confess that when colleagues, told me that we were going to do a 3 hours event on the topic, I thought it was going to be too long, and it's only now that I realize it is too short. I think we covered a lot of ground, really starting from the keynote speech this morning of Vice President Heidi Hautala, who spoke about the important role of accountants, and I can promise I didn't ask her to do so. I think it was also interesting to hear outline the importance of measurement and transparency with reference to the CSRD and to, I believe, Peter Drucker, as she was trying to quote something like, what gets measured gets managed. But I think it's always interesting to get the full quote, because the full quote, I'm going to read it out loud to you, says, what gets measured gets managed, even when it's pointless to measure and manage it, and even if it harms the purpose of the organization to do so. And I think that's pretty much where we've been, because so far we have only measured financial performance, and I believe it is due time to measure what makes life worthwhile, to echo, John Kennedy. Then on these big thoughts from the European Parliament Vice President, we moved on to SMEs, really the backbone of the European economy. And we had a very interesting, if not epic, debate between the whole idea of should the measures be voluntary or should they be mandatory, and between the respective virtues of product norms versus accounting and reporting. And great discussion, but to my view, the truth is that we need both, not one or the other or something in between. And we then had a discussion on corporate governance, another very important theme. And I think the discussion really revealed that there are very high expectations from the European Commission corporate governance proposals that normally we should see in 2 weeks' time, or in 2 years' time, or in 20 years' time, we shall see. But let's hope that we, or rather the planet, will not be disappointed by these proposals, because I really noted very high and legitimate expectations from all the parties to the discussion. And we just concluded now with Paul's panel on public sector. And again, we were reminded of the instrumental role that the public sector has to play. Well, first of all, because it is on our old continent, more or less 50% of the economy, because it has a great leverage power, but also, and probably that's the more important point, because the public sector's leadership is absolutely indispensable. And in terms of political leadership, I can't refrain from commenting on that, because I clearly see great political leadership at EU level, and I would like to commend the European Commission and the European Parliament for this. However, I have more doubts when I listen to national politicians, and unfortunately, the EU can't do much without the member states. So most of these discussions, like the one we just had today, are very often about how much change we need or how quickly we need to change. And as we've seen a bit of that today, they oppose those who want to change as little as possible and those who want to change absolutely everything. those who want to change as quickly as possible and those who want to change as slowly as possible. I mean, it was good that we didn't have a representative of those who think that we just have to go to Mars and everything will be fine. Next time we will invite Mr. Musk. And that we were reminded, I think Mary just did that this is not only an issue for future generation, it's also an issue for our generation, because the climate crisis has actually started harming and costing. So, all things considered, to my view, we will have change. And the real choice that we have is between, on the one hand, an orderly transition that we should really start now, or a chaotic transformation, which is what we will have if we don't start the orderly transition now. And at the end of the day, what we need, I believe, is, not slight changes in our economic model, but fundamental shifts in our civilization, so that we can find new sources of profit than mass consumption and new sources of fulfillment than mass consumption. This is actually not meant to be pessimistic, just to reassure my colleague Paul. On the contrary, I think this is optimistic because it is a program that is full of promises. And on that good note, I would like to thank all the speakers. I think they did a fantastic job. I would also like to thank the moderators, who were fantastic, and all my colleagues who made this event possible. And finally, thanks to the audience for sticking with us and listening online. I very much hope that next time we will be at ACE events, our event facilities near the Rond-Point Schumann, and we can meet face to face, even without a mask. Very much looking forward to this. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.